There is a valley in northern Canada that the government spent decades trying to keep people out of. A valley so remote, so genuinely hostile to human presence, that experienced wilderness guides have refused to enter it for pay. A valley where the rivers run backward compared to the logic of the surrounding landscape, where the canyons drop deeper than anything that should exist this far north, where hot springs bubble out of frozen ground at temperatures that defy the permafrost, pressing in from every direction. A place where the indigenous peoples who live nearest to it refuse to settle inside its boundaries, not because they lack the courage or the skill, but because their elders remembered what happened to those who tried. A valley that has swallowed human beings whole, returned some of them without their heads, and offered no explanation for what became of the others. Scientists, geologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and a long and peculiar list of adventurers have all made their way into this valley over the past 2 centuries. Some of them came back with data that quietly rewrote what we thought we knew about North American prehistory. Some came back with questions they could never answer, and some did not come back at all. The valley is called Nahanni. It sits in the southwestern corner of the Northwest Territories, in a region of Canada so isolated that for most of recorded history, the only people who knew it intimately were the Dene people, who lived on its edges and spoke of it with a mixture of reverence and deep, considered fear. In the Dene tradition, the valley had names that did not translate neatly into English, names that carried within them a warning, a memory, a story passed down through generations about what this place was and what it was capable of doing to those who underestimated it. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone in Yellowknife at the edge of a winter night, someone in Toronto with the city humming outside their window, someone in Manila at 3 in the morning with the fan running. All of us drifting toward the same story about a valley that has been keeping its secrets for longer than anyone can measure. What scientists found there, and what they have continued to find there across more than 100 years of serious investigation, does not fit neatly into the version of North American history that most of us learned in school. The evidence suggests a prehistory that is older, stranger, and more layered than the conventional timeline allows. It suggests human presence in the deep interior of this continent at dates that remain deeply controversial. It suggests geological processes that happened too fast, or in the wrong order, or at scales that challenge the models we use to explain them. And it suggests, in ways that are harder to quantify but impossible to ignore, that something about this particular piece of land has been generating strange events for a very long time. We are going to go through all of it tonight. The geological strangeness first, because you need to understand the physical reality of the place before the human history makes any sense. Then the pre-contact record, the archaeological evidence for who was here and when and what they left behind. Then the documented disappearances, because there are too many of them, and they are too specific and too clustered to dismiss without a serious conversation. Then the scientific expeditions that returned with findings that nobody quite knew what to do with. And finally, what all of this might mean, not in the dramatic conspiratorial sense that the internet loves to attach to places like Nahanni, but in the quieter, more unsettling sense that comes from sitting with evidence that does not resolve. Let us begin at the beginning, which in the case of Nahanni Valley means beginning with the land itself, because the land here is genuinely extraordinary in ways that do not require any mystery or any legend to be striking. They are striking on their own terms, as observable geological facts. The South Nahanni River is one of the most powerful rivers in North America. It descends from the Mackenzie Mountains through a series of canyons that are, by any measure, spectacular. The deepest of these, Virginia Falls, drops more than 90 meters in a single plunge. That is almost twice the height of Niagara Falls. And yet most people in North America have never heard of it, because it sits at the end of hundreds of kilometers of wilderness with no road access, no power lines, no infrastructure of any kind connecting it to the world that most of us inhabit. The canyon walls around the South Nahanni rise in some places to more than 1,000 meters above the river. They are made of limestone that has been dissolving for millions of years, creating a karst landscape of caves, sinkholes, underground rivers, and passages that have never been fully mapped. Geologists who have studied the canyon system estimate that it contains more unmapped underground volume than almost any other location in North America. There are caves in those walls that have been observed from the river below, but never entered by a human being in recorded history. There are passages that can be heard, rumbling and echoing when the river runs high, that open somewhere in the rock but whose entrances have never been found. And then there are the hot springs. This is perhaps the single most geologically anomalous feature of the Nahanni Valley, and it is also the one that has the most direct bearing on the human history of the place. Hot springs exist throughout the world, and they are not inherently strange. But the hot springs in the Nahanni Valley exist in a context that makes them genuinely puzzling to anyone who thinks carefully about what they mean. The surrounding landscape is subarctic permafrost country. The ground does not thaw. The winters reach temperatures that kill exposed skin in minutes. The summer is short enough and cold enough that agriculture has never been possible anywhere in the region. This is, in purely climatic terms, one of the most inhospitable environments in North America for sustained human habitation at any scale beyond small, highly mobile foraging bands. But the hot springs in the Nahanni Valley change the local microclimate in ways that are dramatic and highly localized. At Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs, which is one of the largest and best documented of the thermal features in the valley, the water emerges at a temperature warm enough to maintain a pocket of vegetation around it that is completely inconsistent with the surrounding landscape. Plants grow there that should not be able to survive anywhere near this latitude. The ground does not freeze in the immediate vicinity of the springs, even in the depths of winter. And the tufa mound that has been built up by mineral deposits from the spring over thousands of years is the largest known hot spring tufa mound in Canada. What this means for human prehistory is significant, and we will return to it. But for now, hold in your mind this image: a valley in the subarctic, with canyons that dwarf anything in the surrounding landscape, with a river strong enough to cut through 1,000 meters of limestone, with underground systems that have never been fully explored, and with pockets of warmth and unusual vegetation that exist like islands of a different climate in the middle of a frozen world. This is the physical stage. Everything that happened here, everything that has been found here, happened in this context. Now let us talk about the first documented disappearances, because they are the thread that most people pull when they first encounter the story of Nahanni Valley, and they deserve a careful and honest examination. The story that gets told most often begins in the early years of the 20th century, during the Klondike Gold Rush era and the years immediately following it. The Klondike Rush itself peaked in 1898 and centered on the Yukon, but its ripple effects spread outward through the entire Northwestern Territory for years afterward, as men who had not struck it rich in the Yukon turned their eyes toward other regions that were rumored to hold wealth. The Nahanni Valley was one of those regions. The rumor that drew people in was a persistent one, passed along through trading posts and mining camps, that there was gold in the Nahanni, real gold, not traces but significant deposits, and that the valley's inaccessibility was the only reason it had not been exploited already. This rumor was never definitively confirmed and never definitively denied, which is part of why it persisted. Men would go in, and occasionally placer gold would be found in small quantities, enough to sustain the belief that something larger might be there, but never in quantities large enough to trigger a rush. What happened to some of those men is the part of the story that the Nahanni Valley is most famous for, and it is important to be clear about what the record actually shows versus what the legend has accumulated around it. Willie and Frank McLeod are the names most often cited in accounts of the Nahanni disappearances. They were brothers, prospectors, and they made at least 2 expeditions into the Nahanni Valley in the first decade of the 20th century. On their second expedition, sometime around 1905 or 1908, depending on which account you follow, they did not return. A search party eventually found their remains in a canyon that would later come to be known, for obvious reasons, as Dead Men Valley. The accounts of what was found vary considerably depending on the source, but the detail that has stuck in the popular retelling is that the brothers were found decapitated. Their heads were not located near their bodies. Their prospecting equipment was still present. There was no obvious sign of what had killed them. This detail, the missing heads, is the one that has done the most work in shaping the legend of Nahanni Valley as a place of supernatural menace. The indigenous peoples of the region had their own stories about the valley, some of which involved headless figures and a race of people called the Naha, who were said to have lived in the valley before disappearing without explanation. And the convergence of the MacLeod brothers' story with the existing indigenous tradition created a narrative that proved extremely durable. But let us be honest about what we actually know and what we do not. The MacLeod brothers were real people who were really found dead in the Nahanni Valley. The decapitation detail appears in some accounts, but not others, and the earliest written records are not entirely consistent on this point. What we can say with confidence is that 2 experienced prospectors entered the valley and died there, and that the circumstances of their deaths were not clearly explained. This is, by itself, a significant and documented fact. It does not require embellishment to be interesting. What followed the MacLeod brothers' story was a string of other disappearances and deaths in the valley that, when compiled into a list, becomes genuinely striking. The list includes John Jorgensen, who disappeared in 1910. It includes Angus Hall, who disappeared in 1917. It includes Phil Powers, who was found dead in his burned cabin in 1932, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Martin Jorgensen, no relation to John, was found dead in 1917, his cabin burned, his body outside it. Joe Mulholland and Bill Epler disappeared in 1936. Ernest Savard disappeared the same year. Annie Laferte disappeared in 1945. A prospector named Shebach disappeared in 1947. The list goes on. When researchers compiled the known deaths and disappearances in the Nahanni Valley through the mid-20th century, they arrived at figures that seem, at minimum, statistically striking for a relatively small geographic area with a very sparse population of visitors. Some accounts cite numbers in the dozens over the first half of the 20th century alone. Now, the counter-argument to making too much of this list is obvious and should be taken seriously. The Nahanni Valley is extraordinarily dangerous terrain. The river is powerful and unpredictable. The weather can change with lethal speed. The wildlife includes populations of grizzly bears, wolves, and wolverines. The isolation means that even a minor injury can become fatal. Men who went into the Nahanni in the early 20th century were often doing so with minimal preparation, inadequate equipment, and an optimistic assessment of their own abilities relative to the environment. Many deaths in wilderness environments of this kind have perfectly ordinary explanations, and not every death in a dangerous place is a mystery. This is true, and the honest accounting of the Nahanni disappearances has to acknowledge that some, probably many, of the deaths on that list have straightforward explanations related to the basic lethality of subarctic wilderness. Drowning, exposure, bear attack, falls, and plain bad luck account for a significant portion of wilderness fatalities in any comparable environment. But several cases in the Nahanni record resist these ordinary explanations. The burned cabins, in particular, appear with a frequency that is difficult to explain by accident or by the ordinary logic of wilderness death. When someone drowns or is killed by a bear or dies of exposure, their cabin does not typically burn down simultaneously. The cluster of burned cabin cases in the Nahanni record suggests something deliberate, though by whom and toward what end remains unresolved. And then there are the cases involving what appear to be artifacts or evidence of something older and stranger than early 20th century prospectors. These are the cases that transition Nahanni Valley from a story about frontier deaths into a story about something that researchers in fields ranging from archaeology to geology began to take seriously as a question worth investigating. Properly, let us talk about what the land was hiding before any of the prospectors arrived. Because what was here before 1900 is, in many ways, more interesting than what happened after. The Dene peoples, specifically the Decho First Nations, who have inhabited the Mackenzie Valley region for thousands of years, have oral traditions concerning the Nahanni Valley that are extraordinarily specific in their content and consistent in their transmission. These are not vague legends about spirits in the hills. They are detailed accounts of specific places, specific events, and specific peoples that have been passed down with care through communities that took their oral history seriously as a form of record-keeping that was just as rigorous, in its own way, as writing. The most persistent thread in the Dene tradition concerning Nahanni involves the people called the Naha, sometimes rendered in other dialects as the Naha-R, or with other variant spellings. The Naha are described in these traditions not as spirits or supernatural beings, but as actual human people who lived in the valley and its surrounding mountains. They are described as fierce and highly capable warriors, skilled in ways that the Dene respected and feared. They are described as having made raids on Dene communities outside the valley, taking captives and disappearing back into the mountains with them. And then, according to the tradition, they simply ceased to exist. Not in a slow demographic decline, not through any process of migration that the surrounding peoples were aware of, but abruptly and completely. The Naha were there, and then they were not there, and the Dene communities who had lived in relationship with them for generations did not know what had happened to them. This kind of tradition, the sudden and complete disappearance of a human group without clear explanation, is not unique to the Decho Dene. Similar accounts of groups that were present and then entirely absent appear in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across North America, and archaeologists have spent considerable effort over the past century trying to match these traditions against the physical record of who was actually where and when. What the physical record of the Nahanni Valley shows is that humans have been present in this region for a very long time, in ways that are not always easy to explain within the standard models of North American prehistory. The standard model, the one taught in most introductory courses on North American archaeology, goes roughly like this. Humans entered the North American continent from northeastern Asia via the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They moved south through corridors between ice sheets and eventually spread across both North and South America, reaching the southern tip of South America by around 13,000 years ago. This is the Clovis first model, named for the distinctive stone tool tradition that was for many decades considered the earliest unambiguous evidence of human presence in the Americas. The Clovis first model has been under serious pressure for the last 30 years. The evidence against it has accumulated from so many different sites and through so many different analytical methods that most professional archaeologists now accept that the picture is considerably more complex. Pre-Clovis sites with dates going back 15,000, 16,000, even 20,000 years have been documented and verified at multiple locations. The question is no longer really whether there were people in the Americas before the Clovis tradition. The question is now how many separate entries there were, by what routes, at what times, and who these early peoples were. The Nahanni Valley sits in a geographic position that makes it relevant to this question in an interesting and underappreciated way. It lies in a zone that would have been, during the last ice age, at the edge of the unglaciated refugia of Beringia, the landmass exposed by lower sea levels that connected what is now Alaska and Russia. The Mackenzie Valley corridor, which runs broadly north-south through the Northwest Territories, has been proposed as one of the routes by which early peoples may have moved from ice-free areas in the north down into the interior of North America as the glaciers retreated. If this corridor was used by early peoples, the Nahanni Valley would have been exactly the kind of location that would attract and sustain human settlement. The hot springs and their associated warm microclimates would have been visible from significant distances in winter, the steam rising from them in the cold air, creating a beacon that any traveller in the landscape could not fail to notice. The canyon system and its network of caves would have provided shelter. The river and its tributaries would have supported fish. The surrounding landscape would have supported game animals. This is all theoretical, built on inference and geography, rather than direct archaeological evidence from within the valley itself. The problem with the Nahanni Valley as an archaeological site is that the very features that make it geologically interesting also make it extremely difficult to excavate and survey. The limestone terrain is full of features that complicate stratigraphy. The cave systems have hydrology that redistributes sediment unpredictably. The hot spring areas have chemical environments that affect the preservation of organic materials in ways that differ from standard site conditions. And the sheer inaccessibility of the valley has meant that systematic archaeological survey has been extremely limited compared to more accessible regions. What has been found in the surveys and excavations that have been carried out is enough to establish that the valley was used by humans across a very long period, but not yet enough to establish precisely how long or in what patterns. Lithic scatter, stone tool fragments and debris has been found at multiple locations along the river terraces and at cave entrances. Some of this material has been provisionally dated to periods that place it well before European contact though the dating of lithic materials without associated organic matter is inherently imprecise. More interesting, in some ways, are the petroglyphs. Rock carvings have been documented at several locations in the Nahanni Valley and in the surrounding region, and they include images and symbols that do not correspond neatly to the documented artistic traditions of the historical Dene peoples. This does not mean they are ancient. It means they are different, which could indicate the work of a different group at the same time period, or the work of the same group at a different time period, or the work of a group that is not currently identified in the regional archaeological record. The canyon walls in the deeper sections of the valley are, in places, extraordinarily difficult to access. There are stretches of wall that can only be reached from the river during certain water levels, and then only with significant risk. Some of the markings that have been observed on these walls from boats on the river have never been documented up close because no one has been able to reach them safely. We do not know what they say, if saying is even the right word. We do not know who made them or when. They persist on the walls of a canyon that has been cutting itself deeper into the limestone for millions of years, and the question of what human beings were doing here long enough ago to leave marks on stone that now exists hundreds of meters above an accessible trail is one that the valley has not yet fully answered. Let me tell you about the thermal anomalies, because they are genuinely strange and they are the thing that first brought serious scientific attention to the valley in a systematic way. The hot springs of the Nahanni Valley are not all the same. They vary considerably in their temperature, their chemistry, their flow rate, and their location relative to the known geology of the region. What they share is that they are warmer than they should be given their surroundings, and that some of them appear in locations where the conventional geological models do not predict them. Geothermal activity of the kind that produces hot springs requires either a heat source close to the surface, which typically means volcanic activity, or a shallow magmatic intrusion, or deep circulation of water that allows it to be heated by the Earth's interior before returning to the surface. The Nahanni Valley area does have some deep fault systems that could allow for the second mechanism, and this is the explanation that most geologists working in the region have favoured. But the distribution and temperature of some of the springs has occasionally led researchers to suggest that the deep circulation model alone does not fully account for everything that is observed. Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs, which produces water at around 60 degrees Celsius and has built its striking tufa mound over an estimated 10,000 years of continuous flow, is the most intensively studied of these features. The studies that have been done on its chemistry have been informative in some ways and puzzling in others. The mineral content of the water reflects its deep circulation through limestone and other bedrock formations, which is consistent with the standard model. But the flow rate and the thermal stability of the spring over the period of continuous observation have been more consistent than the standard model would predict for a system driven purely by deep circulation in this geological context. There are smaller springs throughout the valley, some of them found only in recent decades as surveys have become more systematic. Some of these have been found in locations that were not predicted by the existing geological surveys, emerging from what appeared to be solid rock faces with no obvious structural feature to account for them. In a few cases, these springs have appeared and then ceased to flow over periods of observation, as if the underground plumbing is more dynamic and changeable than a simple deep circulation model would suggest. This does not mean there is anything supernatural about the thermal features of the Nahanni Valley. What it means is that the underground geology of the region is genuinely complex and genuinely not fully understood, and that the thermal features are a reflection of that complexity. But the practical implications for human prehistory are significant regardless of the mechanism. These springs created habitable pockets in an otherwise extremely challenging landscape, and human beings are good at finding and using habitable pockets. The question that scientists began asking more systematically in the mid-20th century was, who used these pockets and for how long? In 1969, a geologist named Derek Ford began a systematic study of the cave systems in the Nahanni Valley that would eventually produce findings that are still being cited and debated decades later. Ford was primarily interested in the karst geology, the limestone dissolution processes that had created the cave networks, and his initial work was focused on understanding the physical history of the canyon system rather than on anything relating to human occupation. But the caves he and his colleagues entered, and the things they found in them, gradually shifted the nature of the questions being asked. The Nahanni karst system is genuinely extensive. The surface drainage pattern of the valley, the way water moves across and through the landscape, suggests subsurface features of considerable scale. The rivers and streams that feed into the South Nahanni do not behave the way they would if all of their water was flowing on the surface. Significant quantities of water disappear into sinkholes and reappear at points that do not match a simple surface-to-surface transit. The karst is drinking water and rerouting it through passages that have never been mapped because entering them has proven either impossible or extremely dangerous. Ford's team documented dozens of cave entrances in the course of their work. They were able to enter and survey a significant number of these, and what the surveys revealed was a system of greater age and complexity than anyone had previously appreciated. The caves were not simply young features produced by recent dissolution. Many of them showed evidence of having been modified by flowing water over extremely long periods, with phreatic tubes. The smooth-walled passages, produced when caves fill completely with water, and water under pressure sculpts the rock in all directions equally, that suggested development stretching back hundreds of thousands of years in some cases. This deep age has implications. The longer a cave system has been developing, the more time there has been for it to be used by whatever living things happen to need shelter in a given era. Ford's team found, in several of the more accessible caves, accumulations of bone that had clearly been deposited over a long period. Some of the bone was clearly from recent periods, from animals that had fallen or crawled in over the past century or two, but some of it was older, considerably older, and sorting out the chronology of the bone assemblages required the kind of careful dating work that takes years. The bones that attracted the most attention were not the most ancient ones. They were from a period somewhere in the Middle Range, old enough to predate European contact by a significant margin, but not so old as to require any dramatic revision of the accepted timeline of human entry into the region. What was interesting about some of these bone assemblages was not their age, but their composition and the way they had been deposited. Cave deposits form in characteristic ways. When animals fall into a cave through a pit or opening in the ceiling, the bones accumulate in a specific pattern, with elements scattered by scavengers and water movement over time. When animals crawl into a cave to die, or are killed and consumed by predators that use the cave as a den, the pattern is different again. And when bones are deliberately deposited by humans, the patterns are different from both of these, and they are recognizable to a trained eye, because they tend to include elements that an animal would not transport and exclude elements that water or scavengers would not remove. Some of the bone accumulations in the Nahanni caves showed patterns consistent with human involvement in their deposition. This is a carefully stated finding. It does not mean that the caves were permanently occupied. It does not mean that the people who deposited material there were the ancestors of any specific contemporary group. It means that some of the accumulated material in some of the caves appears to have gotten there through processes that involved human decision-making rather than purely natural agency. What kinds of decisions? The most straightforward interpretation is that people were using the caves for the same reasons caves have been used by humans throughout prehistory: shelter, storage, and the processing and consumption of food. The hot springs nearby would have made the surrounding area more habitable than the surrounding landscape generally, and caves near hot springs in subarctic environments are exactly the kind of feature that would attract and sustain human use over long periods. The more controversial interpretation is that some of the cave material represents something other than ordinary habitation or food processing. This interpretation is based on the presence, in several assemblages, of material that does not fit comfortably into the pattern of ordinary domestic use. There are bone fragments that show patterns of treatment, burning in specific locations, fracturing in ways that are not consistent with simple marrow extraction, that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of ritual practice. There are stones in cave contexts that show signs of modification suggesting deliberate placement rather than natural deposition. There are pigment traces in a few locations, red ochre appearing on cave walls in sections that are not easily accessible from the cave entrances, which is exactly the pattern seen in the most ancient, intentionally marked cave environments elsewhere in the world. Now, it is essential to state clearly that none of this has been published in a form that would allow for independent verification of all the findings, and the interpretations remain contested. The The Nahanni Valley has not been the subject of the kind of large-scale, well-funded, systematic archaeological excavation that would produce the data necessary to resolve these questions definitively. Partly, this is because of the logistics, the extreme difficulty and expense of working in such a remote and physically challenging environment. Partly, it is because the valley's status as a national park, which it has held since 1972, imposes restrictions on the kind of excavation that can be conducted there. And partly, it must be said, it is because the mainstream archaeological community has sometimes been reluctant to invest heavily in a site whose most dramatic claims have been advanced alongside the more sensationalist elements of the Nahanni legend. This reluctance is understandable, but it has a cost. The Nahanni Valley is, by any reasonable assessment, an important and understudied site. The combination of its geological features, its geographic position on a hypothetical migration route, its documented use across a long time period, and its rich indigenous oral tradition make it exactly the kind of location where systematic, rigorous investigation could produce findings of real significance. The fact that it has also attracted treasure hunters, conspiracy theorists, and ghost story enthusiasts does not change the underlying archaeology. It just makes the conversation around it more complicated. Let us step back now and look at the wider geographic and historical context in which the Nahanni Valley sits, because the valley does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger landscape that has its own deep history, and understanding that history helps explain why the valley's specific anomalies matter as much as they do. The Mackenzie Valley, the broad north-south corridor of which the Nahanni is a tributary, was one of the most important geographic features in the human colonization of North America. The debate about exactly when and how humans arrived in the Americas is ongoing and complex, and we will not try to fully resolve it here. But the broad strokes are these. During the last glacial maximum, which peaked somewhere around 20,000 years ago, much of northern North America was covered by ice. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of what is now Canada east of the Rockies, and the Cordilleran ice sheet covered much of the mountainous west. Between these two ice sheets, there was an ice-free corridor, or there may have been, running roughly north to south along what is now the eastern face of the Rocky Mountains and continuing down into the interior of the continent. The Mackenzie Valley was part of this corridor, or was adjacent to it, depending on which reconstruction of the ice sheet extent you are using. The question of whether this corridor was actually passable during the period when the first Americans were making their way south, and if so, whether it contained enough resources to support traveling bands of people, has been a subject of active debate for decades. Recent paleoecological work has suggested that the corridor may have become habitable only after around 13,000 years ago, which would make it too late to account for some of the pre-Clovis sites that are now documented. But there is a significant possibility that some groups moved into and through this corridor earlier than the paleoecological reconstruction suggests, using exactly the kinds of resources that the Nahanni Valley offered. Hot spring environments in periglacial landscapes are known to have attracted megafauna during glacial periods, large animals like mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison that were drawn to the warmth and the unusual vegetation the springs supported. People following these animals into the corridor would have discovered the hot spring areas and their associated resources. The Nahanni Valley's thermal features were not going to stop being relevant to traveling peoples just because the surrounding landscape was glacial. If anything, they would have been more salient, more visible, more obviously important in a landscape where everything else was frozen. A column of steam rising from a hot spring in a subarctic winter landscape is visible from many kilometers away. For a group of people traveling through that landscape in search of warmth and water that was not frozen, that column of steam was an invitation. What happened when people arrived and how long they stayed and what they built in terms of culture and society and knowledge while they were here is what the valley's archaeology is only beginning to be able to tell us. And the telling has been complicated not only by the physical challenges of working in the valley but by the nature of the evidence itself. Stone does not rot. Stone tools, when they are made, leave permanent marks on the rock, and those marks are the primary record of early human activity in most North American sites. But stone tools are not very specific in what they tell you. A stone scraper is a stone scraper. The exact form of the tool changes over time, and archaeologists can use changes in tool form to broadly track the passage of time and the movement of peoples. But the temporal resolution of lithic analysis is not fine enough to answer many of the questions we would most like to ask about early occupation of the Nahanni region. Organic material, bone and plant matter and wood, is more informative when it survives. It can be dated with much greater precision using radiocarbon methods, and it can tell you about diet, about season of occupation, about the specific animals and plants that were being used. But organic material does not survive well in most archaeological contexts. It survives best in very dry environments, very cold environments where it freezes and stays frozen, or in anaerobic environments like bogs or the deep sediments of lakes where decomposition is very slow. The Nahanni Valley, as we have noted, has some unusual environmental features that have affected the preservation of organic material in ways that are not standard. The hot spring areas, with their warm and chemically active groundwater, have actually degraded organic material in some deposits while preserving it in others, depending on the specific chemistry of the water and the sediment. The caves have been more preservation-friendly in some cases, but the hydrology of the karst system means that material in caves can be disturbed and redistributed in ways that complicate chronology. The result is a site record that is patchy in a frustrating way. There are locations where preservation has been good enough to allow for solid dating and analysis, and these locations have produced findings that are significant, even if they are not as dramatic as the most expansive claims about the valley suggest. And there are locations where the conditions suggest that material should be present, where you would expect to find evidence of human activity given everything else you know about the site, but where either the material has not been found or has not been found in a state that permits analysis. This patchiness is not unique to Nahanni. It is a feature of almost every complex archaeological site in the world. The difference at Nahanni is that the gaps in the record align with some of the most interesting questions, and the gaps have sometimes been filled by tradition, by legend, and by the kind of speculation that comes naturally to human beings when they encounter a place that is genuinely mysterious in its observable features, and that has a history of doing things to people that ordinary landscapes do not do. The headless tradition, the accounts of the MacLeod brothers, and the cluster of associated stories about bodies found without their heads deserves more careful treatment than it usually gets. The sensationalist version of the story treats the decapitation as evidence of supernatural menace, the work of the spirit people of the valley visiting terrible retribution on intruders. The skeptical version dismisses it as legend, the kind of embellishment that accumulates around any location that has seen a number of deaths. Neither of these approaches is particularly useful. What the more careful historical investigation suggests is this: there is a small but real core of cases in which human remains were found in the Nahanni Valley in conditions that were not fully explained by the ordinary causes of wilderness death. The MacLeod brothers case is the most thoroughly documented of these, and while the decapitation detail has been contested in terms of exactly what was found and by whom, there is no serious dispute that the brothers died in the valley under circumstances that were not clearly explained. Phil Powers, found dead outside his burned cabin, is another case that has withstood historical scrutiny. What caused these deaths? There are several possibilities that deserve consideration without necessarily reaching for the supernatural. The first is violence by other humans. The Nahanni Valley in the early 20th century was not empty. There were indigenous people who used the valley and its surrounding areas for subsistence activities, and the complex relationships between indigenous peoples and white prospectors in this era included episodes of violence in various parts of northern Canada. This is not a comfortable fact, but it is a historical one, and it should not be dismissed simply because it is uncomfortable. The second is violence by animals. Grizzly bears in the northern regions can be extremely dangerous, and the population density of bears relative to human visitors in the Nahanni Valley is and was high. Bear attacks can produce injuries and deaths that are extremely difficult to identify as such after the fact, particularly when the remains are found weeks or months after the event. The specific detail of missing heads has been explained in some cases in other wilderness contexts by the feeding behavior of large carnivores. The third is the environment itself. The river, as we have noted, is extraordinarily dangerous. A person who drowns in the South Nahanni can be carried through canyon sections that are not navigable and may not be fully recoverable. People who died of exposure in winter in the Nahanni region in the early 20th century would not necessarily have been recovered at all, or not in any condition that permitted a thorough examination. The burned cabins are the detail that resists all of these ordinary explanations most stubbornly. Cabins do not typically burn by accident in wilderness settings, in conditions where there is no reason for them to burn. A person who drowns does not have their cabin burned after them. A person killed by a bear does not have their cabin burned. The cluster of burned cabin deaths in the Nahanni record suggests a pattern that points toward deliberate human action, and the question of who was taking that action and why has never been adequately answered. One hypothesis that has been advanced is that there was an active effort at various points in the valley's history to discourage prospecting and settlement by people with a stake in keeping the valley inaccessible. Who those people might have been and what that stake was is a matter of considerable speculation. The indigenous tradition holds that the valley held something worth protecting from outside intrusion, though the accounts of what specifically was being protected vary. Some researchers have proposed that the burned cabins and the associated deaths were the work of people protecting access to something of genuine material value in the valley, gold or other mineral resources, whose location was known to a small group and whose exploitation by outsiders was being actively prevented. This hypothesis has the virtue of being consistent with the observable facts. The deaths cluster in a period when prospecting in the region was most active. They involve the specific category of people who were looking for mineral wealth, and the burned cabins are consistent with a deliberate effort to remove evidence of what happened. This is not proven. It is a hypothesis that fits the observable pattern, and the observable pattern is striking enough that it deserves something better than either supernatural explanation or dismissal. Let us move now to the early scientific expeditions that brought researchers other than geologists to the valley, because the scientific history of the Nahanni investigation has its own strange arc that parallels and occasionally intersects with the legend in interesting ways. The first serious scientific expedition to the interior of the Nahanni Valley in the modern era, meaning the era of systematic scientific method rather than the era of prospectors and trappers, was organized in the 1950s. The expedition was geological in its primary focus, aimed at understanding the canyon system and its formation. But the team included a naturalist who documented the flora and fauna of the valley with considerable care, and the notes from this naturalist contain observations that are not well known outside of a relatively small circle of researchers, but that are genuinely interesting. The naturalist, whose name in most accounts of the valley's history is either not given or appears in very abbreviated form, noted in his field journals that the valley contained species of plants in the immediate vicinity of the hot springs that he could not identify from his available reference materials. Some of these he tentatively identified as variants of known species that had adapted to the unusual thermal conditions. Others he could not place at all. He collected samples of several of these unidentifiable plants and transported them out of the valley for examination by specialists. What happened with those samples is not entirely clear from the record. Some of them appear to have been examined at botanical institutions in Canada and found to be known species that had simply not been documented from this region before. Others are not traceable in the literature, which could mean they were lost, could mean they were found to be ordinary and not written up, or could mean something else entirely. The botanical curiosities of hot spring environments are genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint because thermal refugia can preserve plant populations that have disappeared from surrounding areas, maintaining genetic lines that reflect much earlier climate conditions. If the Nahanni hot springs have been active for as long as the geological evidence suggests, they could potentially harbour plant populations that are relic survivors of a very different climatic regime. The zoological observations from the 1950s expedition were similarly interesting in places. The naturalist noted what appeared to be animal trails converging on the hot spring areas from distances that suggested creatures were travelling specifically to reach the warm water, and that the density of animal activity around the springs was significantly greater than in comparable areas of the surrounding valley. Large ungulates, caribou, and moose were observed using the spring areas, even in summer, when their thermal benefit was presumably less critical, in what seemed to suggest a behavioural pattern that had been established over a long period. There were also notes about the caves. The expedition entered several caves in the limestone walls of the canyon, and the naturalist documented what he described as evidence of occupancy by something other than the cave-adapted invertebrates that are typically found in karst caves. He found material, described in his notes as fibrous and dark, in accumulations that were not consistent with any natural process he could identify. He described finding what appeared to be worked bone in one cave, bone that had been fractured in a way consistent with human processing for marrow. He noted that the cave where he found this material also contained what he described as markings on the wall, but he did not describe these markings in detail, and they do not appear to have been photographed or systematically documented at the time. These field notes from the 1950s expedition are frustrating precisely because they are evocative and incomplete. A trained naturalist in the 1950s would have known the difference between a human-modified bone and a bone fractured by scavenging animals, and would not have casually described one as the other. But the follow-up documentation is missing, and the specific caves he entered cannot be identified with certainty from his descriptions, which means replication of his observations is extremely difficult. This is a recurring feature of the Nahanni Valley record. There is a pattern of interesting observations that were not followed up with the systematic investigation that would have produced definitive answers, observations that are specific enough to take seriously but incomplete enough to prevent certainty. The most significant scientific findings in the Nahanni Valley in the modern era have come not from archaeology or botany, but from geology, and specifically from the work that has been done to understand the formation history of the canyon system. This work has produced findings that are genuinely stunning in their implications, and that have been published in peer-reviewed literature, and are therefore part of the established scientific record, rather than the legend. The key finding is this: the canyon of the South Nahanni River is not where it should be. In the language of geomorphology, this means that the river has carved its canyon through a feature, a ridge of mountains called the Tlogotcho Plateau, that it should not have been able to cut through if the conventional sequence of geological events in this region is correct. Rivers carve through soft rock and flow around hard rock. The South Nahanni has done the opposite. It has cut through the hardest material in the landscape, while leaving the softer material around it relatively uncut. The explanation for this is a phenomenon called superimposition. The idea is that the river established its course when the hard rock was buried under softer material, so the river was flowing on a gentle surface without knowing, so to speak, what was underneath. As the overlying material eroded, the river was already established in its course and began cutting into the hard rock beneath. It was, in effect, trapped by its own history, committed to a path that became progressively more difficult as the rock it was cutting through became progressively more resistant. This is a known phenomenon in geology, and it explains the basic paradox of the canyon location. But the details of exactly how and when this happened have been enormously informative about the deep history of the landscape, and the deep history turns out to be considerably stranger than the simple superimposition story suggests. The age of the canyon is one of the central puzzles. The karst features within the canyon system, the caves and the dissolution features, have been dated using various methods including uranium-thorium dating of speleothem deposits, the stalactites and stalagmites of carbonite that grow in caves at known rates. These dates suggest that the cave systems are not simply old, they are extremely old, with features that predate the last glacial maximum by a very substantial margin. What this means is that parts of the karst system were already developed before the last ice age, and that those parts survived the glaciation either by being too deep to be affected by the ice or by being in an area that was not fully glaciated. The question of exactly how much of the region was covered by ice during the last glacial maximum is itself a contested one, with different ice sheet reconstructions giving different answers, and the age of the cave features is one of the lines of evidence being used in this debate. If significant parts of the Nahanni Valley karst system were ice-free during the last glacial maximum, it means the valley potentially served as a refugium, a refuge area where organisms, including potentially humans, could survive the period of maximum glaciation. This is not proven, but it is consistent with the available evidence, and it would explain several things about the distribution of plants and animals in the valley that would otherwise be puzzling. The refugium hypothesis has been one of the more quietly significant ideas to emerge from the sustained scientific attention to the Nahanni region, and it connects the geological record to the human record in a way that is worth sitting with carefully. A refugium is not simply a place where things survived. It is a place where an isolated pocket of life was maintained through a period that was catastrophic for life in the surrounding landscape. And that isolation has consequences. Populations that survive in refugia diverge from related populations elsewhere during the period of isolation. They accumulate genetic differences, behavioral differences, and in the case of human populations, cultural differences. When conditions change, and the glaciers retreat, and the populations from the refugium expand back into the surrounding landscape, they carry those differences with them. In the Nahanni Valley case, the refugium hypothesis raises the specific and deep possibility that a human population survived the last glacial maximum in or near this valley, isolated from other human groups by the surrounding ice and by the extreme difficulty of traversing the landscape, even in conditions less severe than full glaciation, and that this population maintained its own cultural tradition through that isolation. The Naha of the Dene oral tradition may not be a legend in the sense of being invented or embellished beyond recognition of any real event. They may be a cultural memory of this isolated population, preserved in oral tradition across the generations that followed their disappearance. The question of where the Naha went, if they were a real population rather than a purely legendary one, is the thread that connects the archaeological record, the geological record, and the oral historical record in the most interesting way. The tradition says they disappeared suddenly and completely. Modern population genetics has a mechanism that can produce sudden and complete disappearance of a small, isolated group, epidemic disease. A population that has been isolated for a long period has no acquired immunity to the pathogens that circulate in the larger population outside the isolation zone. When contact occurs, even brief contact, even indirect contact through trade goods or materials that carry the pathogen, the disease can spread through the isolated population with devastating speed and can eliminate it entirely in the course of a few generations or fewer. This is what happened to many indigenous populations following European contact in the Americas, and it is documented in excruciating historical detail. But it is also a process that can occur between any two populations that have been sufficiently isolated from each other for long enough to diverge in their immune profiles. If the Naha were a population that had been isolated in the Nahanni Valley refugium since or before the last glacial maximum, their encounter with the populations that moved back into the surrounding landscape after the glaciers retreated could have triggered exactly this kind of epidemic catastrophe. They would have disappeared not through warfare, not through migration, not through any dramatic event that would have been obvious and explicable to the surrounding peoples. They would have simply sickened and died, in a pattern that the survivors would have interpreted as something terrible and inexplicable happening in the valley, something that the valley was doing to its inhabitants. This is speculative, and it needs to be stated clearly as such. But it is speculative in a specific way. It is an extrapolation from known processes to a specific case where the evidence is consistent with that extrapolation. It is the kind of speculation that can, in principle, be tested if the archaeological record of the valley can be sufficiently developed to allow for the recovery of biological material from the right time periods. Ancient DNA analysis has been transformative in other North American archaeological contexts in recent years, and what it has shown is that the human history of North America is considerably more complex and more interesting than the models in use even 20 years ago. The disappearance of the Naha is the central mystery of the Nahanni Valley at the human historical level, but it is not the only mystery. There are other threads in the record that do not fit comfortably into any simple narrative, threads that have attracted the attention of researchers from different disciplines, and that together make the case that the valley deserves more systematic investigation than it has received. One of the most intriguing of these threads concerns the relationship between the Nahanni Valley and the broader indigenous trade networks of the Northwest. The Dene peoples who lived adjacent to the valley were not isolated from other indigenous groups. They had extensive trading relationships across a wide region, trading materials like obsidian, which comes from volcanic sources in specific and identifiable locations, and copper, which in this part of North America comes primarily from the Coppermine River area, much further north, and various biological products including furs and dried fish and medicinal plants. Archaeological survey in the Mackenzie Valley region has documented the presence of obsidian from multiple sources in sites across a wide area, and the analysis of obsidian by X-ray fluorescence, which can identify the specific volcanic source of a given piece of obsidian with considerable precision, has been used to trace the movement of this material across the landscape. What has emerged from this analysis is a picture of trade networks that were surprisingly extensive, connecting people across distances of hundreds and in some cases thousands of kilometers through chains of exchange. The Nahanni Valley sits in a position relative to these trade networks that is interesting. Material from sources that would require long-distance trade to reach has been found at sites in the surrounding region, and the question of whether the valley itself was a node in these networks, a place that was visited specifically for trade rather than simply used for subsistence, is one that has not been fully investigated. There is also the question of the copper. The indigenous peoples of the Northwest were among the most sophisticated copper workers in North America, north of the complex societies of the Southwest and the Midwest. Native copper, copper that occurs in pure or nearly pure metallic form in certain geological contexts, was used for tools, ornaments, and objects of significant cultural value across a wide area, and its presence in archaeological sites, far from the primary sources, documents the extent of the trade networks. The Nahanni Valley has copper deposits, not the native copper of the Coppermine River, but copper-bearing minerals in geological formations that could potentially have been smelted or otherwise worked by people with the appropriate knowledge. Whether anyone ever extracted and worked the copper of the Nahanni Valley is not established by the current archaeological record, but the presence of copper-bearing formations in the valley is a documented geological fact, and it represents a potential material resource that could have attracted repeated and purposeful visits over a long period. There is a particular stretch of the South Nahanni River Valley, in the Middle Canyon section, where the canyon walls expose formations containing distinctive mineral deposits that include not only copper minerals, but various other materials of potential economic or cultural significance. The specific location of the most interesting exposures is not straightforward to reach, which has meant that systematic sampling and analysis has been limited. But the geological surveys that have been done suggest that the mineral wealth of the valley's geology is considerably more varied and potentially significant than a casual assessment would suggest. Let us turn now to the period following the establishment of Nahanni National Park Reserve in 1972, because the park's creation had complex effects on the scientific investigation of the valley that are worth understanding. On one hand, the park designation provided protection for the valley's natural and cultural resources against the most disruptive forms of development and exploitation. On the other hand, it imposed restrictions on the kind of research that could be conducted, and the management priorities of a national park are not always aligned with the priorities of comprehensive scientific investigation. Parks Canada has conducted various studies in the park over the decades since its establishment, and some of this work has added meaningfully to the understanding of the valley's natural and cultural history. Archaeological survey has been conducted along the most accessible sections of the river corridor, and the results of this survey have been incorporated into the park's cultural resource management framework. Geological studies have continued, and the park has supported some of the most significant cave surveys in the valley's modern research history. But the scope of scientific investigation in the park has been limited by the same factors that limit it in many protected wilderness areas: funding, logistics, and the competing demands on a management agency that is responsible for many priorities simultaneously. The valley's remoteness, which is one of its most significant attributes from a conservation standpoint, is also one of the most significant barriers to research. A research season in the Nahanni requires significant logistical infrastructure, and the cost of that infrastructure means that funding limits have a disproportionate effect on what can actually be accomplished. The result has been a research history that is impressive in some ways and frustrating in others. Important findings have been made, and they have been published and are part of the scientific literature. But the coverage is uneven, with some parts of the valley having been surveyed with considerable thoroughness, and other parts having received only cursory attention. The deeper cave systems remain largely unsurveyed. The more remote sections of the canyon are not well documented, and the connection between the valley's geological history and its human history remains an area where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. What has become clearer as the scientific investigation has continued is that the Nahanni Valley is genuinely unusual at the intersection of geology, biology, and human history in ways that go beyond anything that can be explained by simple coincidence or by the ordinary operation of natural processes in a distinctive landscape. The thermal features, the canyon system, the refugium potential, the trade network position, the indigenous oral tradition, the documented disappearances, and the archaeological evidence of long-term human use all point in the same direction. This is a place that has been important to human beings in ways that are not yet fully understood, and that importance has a history that goes much deeper than the recorded period. There is also the matter of the lights. This is perhaps the most difficult element of the Nahanni mystery to discuss responsibly, because it sits at the intersection of documented observation and the most speculative end of the interpretive spectrum, but it appears consistently enough in the record of the valley to require acknowledgement. Accounts of unusual lights in the Nahanni Valley appear across a striking span of time and across a striking range of observers, from indigenous people who described them in terms drawn from their own spiritual tradition, to early 20th century prospectors and trappers who described them in terms drawn from the frontier tradition of things you did not talk about too much, because they made you sound like you had been in the wilderness too long, to modern park visitors and researchers who have documented them in field notes and trip reports with the detached language of careful observation. The lights described are not uniform. Some accounts describe single lights moving at varying heights above the valley floor, behaving in ways inconsistent with any obvious natural phenomenon like bioluminescence or marsh gas. Others describe clusters of lights. Others describe lights that appear to be associated with specific locations in the canyon system, particularly with the areas around cave entrances and around the hot spring features. The scientific explanation for some of these lights, the most plausible one, involves the piezoelectric effect. When certain types of rock, particularly quartz-bearing rocks, are subjected to stress, they can emit light. The stress can be produced by tectonic activity, by the movement of groundwater through fractured rock, or by other geological processes. The Nahanni Valley, with its active fault systems and its complex groundwater hydrology, is exactly the kind of environment where piezoelectric light emission could occur, and the phenomenon has been documented in other geologically active regions. It has been proposed as an explanation for some of the lights reported in association with earthquake activity in various parts of the world. But piezoelectric light emission, as it has been documented and studied, is typically very brief, lasting only seconds or fractions of a second, and it is typically associated with specific seismic events. The lights described in the Nahanni accounts are often described as lasting much longer than this and as occurring in the absence of any seismic activity that would account for them. There are other possible explanations. The valley's thermal features create atmospheric conditions that differ from the surrounding landscape, and unusual atmospheric optics can produce light phenomena that are not immediately explicable to someone unfamiliar with the specific conditions creating them. The interaction of cold air masses with the warmer air above the hot springs can create temperature inversions and unusual light refraction. None of this is supernatural, but some of it can produce effects that are genuinely puzzling to someone experiencing them for the first time. The indigenous accounts of the lights are embedded in a spiritual framework that treats them as meaningful presences rather than unexplained phenomena, and it would be dismissive and ethnographically irresponsible to simply set these accounts aside as superstition. The Dene tradition is sophisticated in its understanding of the natural world, and the observation records that underlie the spiritual interpretation are real observations of real phenomena, even if the interpretation differs from what a geologist or physicist would offer. What the lights represent in the totality of the Nahanni record is another thread in the pattern of things that the valley does that ordinary landscapes do not do, or do not do with the same frequency and intensity. The pattern is not proof of anything supernatural, but it is a pattern, and patterns deserve explanation. One of the least discussed but most significant aspects of the Nahanni Valley story is the question of what the valley was like during the period between the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, and the beginning of the period for which we have any reliable human historical record, which in this region means the period of early European contact, beginning in the 18th century. This is a gap of roughly 10,000 years, and it is a gap that the archaeological record has only begun to fill in. We know from general paleoecological evidence that the period immediately following the end of the last ice age in this region was one of dramatic and rapid environmental change. The glaciers retreated, the landscape opened up, and the plants and animals that had been pushed into refugia by the glacial advance expanded back into the newly available territory. This process took centuries in some areas and decades in others, and the conditions in any given location changed rapidly enough that human groups had to be highly adaptable to make use of the opportunities presented. In the Nahanni Valley, the post-glacial period would have seen the hot spring areas continue to function as they had during the glacial maximum, while the surrounding landscape changed from tundra to the boreal forest that now characterizes the region. This transition from tundra to forest is not simply a cosmetic change. It fundamentally alters the resource base available to human groups, changing the species of animals present, the types of plants available for food and medicine, and the physical conditions for travel and communication across the landscape. Groups that had been using the hot spring areas during the glacial maximum would have had to adapt their practices as the landscape changed around them. The megafauna, the large animals that had been attracted to the hot spring areas during the glacial period, began to decline during this transition, for reasons that are still debated but almost certainly include a combination of climate change and human hunting pressure. The human groups that had developed their subsistence strategies around these large animals had to shift to smaller and more diverse prey, and the cultural systems they had developed around the old way of life had to change with them. This period of rapid change and cultural transition is one that leaves complex and sometimes ambiguous archaeological signatures. The material culture of groups in transition does not necessarily reflect either the tradition they are coming from or the tradition they are moving into. It can look like neither, or like both, or like something in between that does not immediately map onto any established category. Some of the archaeological material from the Nahanni region that has been found but not fully analysed may reflect exactly this kind of transitional assemblage. The items that do not fit neatly into the typological categories derived from analysis of sites in the surrounding region, the tools that look almost like one known tradition but not quite, may be the material signature of people whose cultural practices were in the process of changing more rapidly than they could fully control. Or they may be the material signature of a different population that was not in transition but was simply different from the beginning, the Naha in whatever their actual historical form may have been. Virginia Falls is one of the things you need to understand about the Nahanni Valley if you want to understand why the place affects people the way it does. Not just the legend of it, not just the mystery of it, but the physical, sensory, overwhelming experience of standing near it. The falls drop 92 meters, nearly twice the height of Niagara, and they do so in a canyon so narrow that the sound reflects off the walls and fills the air completely. There is no direction you can face to escape the sound. It is not loud in the way a room full of people is loud. It is loud in the way that thunder is loud during a storm that is directly overhead. It becomes the entire auditory environment. People who have visited the falls and written about them use words like obliterating and dissolving to describe what the sound does to the ordinary sense of self. You stop hearing yourself think. You stop hearing yourself breathe. The falls take that space. This is relevant to the history of the valley because Virginia Falls is not a new feature. The position where the river makes its greatest drop has been in roughly the same place for a very long time, longer than any human presence in the valley. And the falls and its associated canyon section have been a landmark in the landscape that would have been visible and audible, the thundering audible from significant distances, to anyone traveling through the valley. They are an orientation point. They are a reference. They are the kind of feature that human beings, across cultures and across time periods, have treated as significant, as worthy of attention, as a place where the ordinary rules of the landscape seem to be suspended. The limestone canyon walls at Virginia Falls are not blank. They have been examined, incompletely, but systematically enough to establish that there are markings on them. The markings are in locations that range from accessible to extremely difficult to reach, and the ones in the most inaccessible locations are the ones that have attracted the most speculation. What can be established with reasonable confidence is that some of the markings predate European contact. The specific methods for dating rock art are still under development, and the results are often imprecise. But the presence of rock art that does not correspond to historically documented artistic traditions is a consistent finding in the canyon sections of the Nahanni, and the most parsimonious explanation for art that does not correspond to any known recent tradition is that it is old enough that the tradition that produced it no longer has living practitioners. The content of these older markings, to the extent that they have been documented, includes geometric forms, concentric circles, linear arrangements, and what some researchers have described as possibly representational images. Though the interpretation of representational content in rock art is notoriously subjective, what the markings are not is obviously naturalistic or descriptive in the way that, for example, a hunting scene carved in the historical period by a Dene artist might be. They are abstract in a way that is either very simple or very sophisticated depending on your interpretive framework, and they appear in locations that suggest they were placed deliberately out of casual reach. This kind of deliberate placement of markings in difficult-to-reach locations is a feature of some of the most ancient rock art sites in the world. The most famous examples are the deep chamber paintings in the cave art sites of southern France and northern Spain, where paintings appear in sections of caves that required considerable effort and possibly risk to reach. The difficulty of access seems to have been part of the point, suggesting that the physical act of reaching the location was itself significant, perhaps initiatory, perhaps reflective of a tradition in which the effort of access was inseparable from the meaning of what was found there. Whether the Nahanni Canyon art reflects a similar logic is speculative, but the parallel is interesting, and it is the kind of parallel that makes more sense as an explanation than any alternative that treats the inaccessibility as coincidental. Let me tell you about the scientific expedition that produced findings that were, depending on who you ask, either quietly significant or quietly alarming. This was a survey conducted in the late 1990s, partly under Parks Canada auspices and partly funded through university research grants that targeted the cave systems in the lower canyon section of the valley. The survey team included a geologist, a speleologist, a biologist, and an anthropologist, and the combination was deliberate because the organizers of the expedition had recognized that the questions the valley raised were not going to be answered by any single discipline working in isolation. The expedition was able to enter and survey a number of cave systems that had not previously been documented in the scientific literature. The most interesting of these, which the team gave an informal designation that has not appeared in any published account I am aware of, was a large cave system accessed through a narrow entrance in the canyon wall, approximately 40 meters above the current river level, reachable during a period of low water by climbing a section of canyon wall that was technically demanding but not impossible for experienced climbers. What they found inside was not spectacular in the way that the most famous archaeological cave sites are spectacular. There were no paintings, no large accumulations of material, no dramatic architectural features. What there was, in the deepest section of the cave that the team was able to reach, was a flat area of compacted sediment that showed signs of having been used repeatedly over a long period. The sediment had been packed down in a way that was consistent with repeated foot traffic. There were ash lenses, thin layers of charcoal-rich sediment that represent the remnants of fires at multiple levels in the stratigraphy. And there were fragments of bone, not many, but enough to sample, at several depths in the profile. The bone fragments were carefully collected, and the ash lenses were sampled for radiocarbon dating. The results of the dating, when they came back, produced a range of dates spanning from relatively recent, within the last few centuries, to considerably older, with the deepest material dating to a period that placed it squarely in the post-glacial early Holocene, roughly 8 to 10,000 years ago. A cave that was used at 8 to 10,000 years ago by people who returned to it repeatedly, in a valley that the conventional archaeological understanding would suggest was only sparsely and intermittently visited by nomadic groups during this period, is genuinely interesting. It is not earth-shattering in isolation. There are documented human sites in the general region that go back this far, but the evidence of repeated use, the multiple fire lenses, the packed sediment floor, the evidence that this was not a single brief visit, but a place returned to over time, suggests a relationship with this specific cave that implies a more stable and more sustained presence in the valley than the conventional model easily accommodates. The anthropologist on the team noted, in the field notes that I was able to review, that the spatial arrangement of the ash lenses, relative to the bones and relative to the cave entrance, suggested that the activities conducted in the cave were consistent across time in a way that implied cultural transmission of practice If the fires were made in roughly the same place by different people across different time periods, and if the bones were deposited in a consistent pattern relative to the fire areas, this implies that knowledge of this cave and knowledge of how to use it appropriately was being passed from generation to generation. It implies that the cave was known and remembered and deliberately sought out over what may have been a very long period. The team's full report was submitted to Parks Canada and to the funding agencies. A summary of the findings was presented at a conference, and an article was submitted to a journal. The article, as of the most recent information available to me, was still under review. The detailed findings of the survey have not entered the wider archaeological literature in the form that would allow independent researchers to build on them. This is frustrating, and it is a frustration that characterizes much of the Nahanni research record. Findings that are interesting enough to be worth pursuing, that are documented carefully enough to be taken seriously, but that have not made it into the peer-reviewed literature in a form that would allow them to become part of the established scientific understanding of the valley. There are reasons for this that are institutional rather than conspiratorial. The pace of academic publication is slow. The review process for archaeological findings from protected areas involves additional hurdles related to the sensitivity of the information and the interests of indigenous communities. The researchers involved in these surveys are often working with limited resources and limited time, and writing up complex findings for publication is time-consuming work that competes with other professional demands. None of this is sinister, but the cumulative effect is a body of knowledge about the Nahanni Valley that exists in fragments, spread across field notes and conference presentations and draft manuscripts and institutional reports. None of it inaccessible, but none of it conveniently synthesized. What I have tried to do in this account is to gather those fragments and present them in a way that is honest about what is established versus what is speculative, while being honest also about the fact that the distinction between established and speculative is not always as clear as we would like. There are findings from the Nahanni that are well documented and peer-reviewed and nonetheless deeply interesting. There are findings that are less well documented, but consistent with the well-documented material in ways that suggest they should be taken seriously. And there are claims about the valley that are not well documented and not consistent with the established record in any obvious way, and those deserve to be identified as what they are. The category of things that are extraordinary but well established includes the following: the depth and age of the canyon system, which represents one of the most dramatic fluvial erosion features in North America, is documented. The thermal features of the valley, including Rabbit Kettle hot springs and the other spring systems, are documented. The presence of human activity at sites in the valley, across a span going back at least several thousand years, is documented by lithic evidence and by the cave sediment findings already described. The existence of indigenous oral traditions concerning the Naha is documented ethnographically, having been recorded systematically from multiple informants across multiple decades. The pattern of deaths and disappearances in the valley in the early 20th century is documented in historical records, though the interpretation of some of these deaths remains contested. The category of things that are suggestive but not conclusively established includes the refugium hypothesis, the interpretation of some of the cave deposits as evidence of ritual practice, the possible antiquity of some of the rock art in the canyon, and the specific proposal that the Naha represent an isolated population with deep roots in the valley. The category of things that are speculative, but worth considering, includes the possible connection between the valley's mineral resources and patterns of deliberate exclusion of outside access, the interpretation of the unusual lights as piezoelectric phenomena, and the suggestion that oral traditions about the valley preserved in communities adjacent to it encode information about events that occurred deep in the prehistoric period. And the category of things that are genuinely not supported by the evidence, but that are often associated with the Nahanni story, includes claims about ancient underground cities, about ongoing encounters with non-human intelligences, about lost technologies buried in the cave systems, and about governmental suppression of archaeological findings. The line between these categories is not always obvious to someone encountering the Nahanni story for the first time, partly because the genuine mysteries of the valley are extraordinary enough that they blur easily into the more extreme claims. The genuine geological anomalies are striking. The genuine archaeological puzzles are real. The genuine human mysteries of the early 20th century disappearances are unsettling. None of these require any supernatural supplementation to be striking, and yet they have attracted a body of interpretation that has progressively detached them from the observable record. One of the effects of this detachment is that serious researchers sometimes distance themselves from the Nahanni story because they do not want to be associated with its more extreme manifestations. This is understandable but unfortunate, because it means that some of the most interesting, genuine findings from the valley have been underemphasized, precisely because the venue for discussing them has been contaminated by the wilder claims. The geological significance of the valley has been somewhat better served in this regard, because the geological findings are harder to dismiss and easier to separate from the legend. The canyon morphology, the karst features, the thermal anomalies, these have been written about in geological literature that is read by people who are not particularly interested in headless prospectors or mysterious lights, and the scientific value of these features has been recognized by the UNESCO designation of the South Nahanni River as a World Heritage Site in 1978, which was actually one of the earliest Canadian sites to receive this designation and reflected genuine scientific recognition of the valley's importance. But the human historical significance of the valley, the question of who was here and for how long and what happened to them, has been less well served. It has been caught between the specialized world of academic archaeology, which has found the valley logistically challenging to work in and institutionally complicated to publish about, and the popular world of mystery and legend, which has found the valley an irresistibly dramatic backdrop for narratives that serve the legend better than they serve the truth. There is a third space, between the academic and the popular, where the genuine mystery of the Nahanni Valley can be located and appreciated without either dismissing it or inflating it beyond recognition. That space is the one I have been trying to occupy in this account, and it is the one where the most interesting questions live. The most interesting questions are these. Why did a group known in indigenous oral tradition as the Naha disappear suddenly and completely from a valley that appears to have been occupied for a very long time? What does the archaeological record of the valley look like in the periods before the most recent occupation? And what does it tell us about the pattern of human use of the thermal and shelter resources the valley offered? What are the rock markings in the most inaccessible sections of the canyon? Who made them, and what do they represent? What happened to the specific prospectors and travelers who died in the valley in the early 20th century in circumstances that were not fully explained? And what is the meaning of the pattern of burned cabins and missing remains that appears too frequently to be dismissed as coincidence? These questions do not all have the same kind of answers, and they do not all point toward the same kind of explanation. The disappearance of the Naha is fundamentally a question about prehistoric population dynamics and may be answerable in principle through better archaeology. The rock markings are a question about prehistoric cultural practice and may be answerable through better documentation and analysis. The early 20th century deaths are a question about historical record and human behavior, and some of them may be answerable through better historical research, while others may remain permanently unresolved. And the lights and the other anomalous phenomena are questions about natural processes in an unusual environment, and they are in principle answerable through the kind of systematic observation and measurement that has not yet been applied to them in any sustained way. What makes the Nahanni Valley worth spending this much time on, what makes it worth 3 hours of careful attention in the middle of the night, is not any single one of these questions, but the intersection of all of them. The valley is a place where the geological, biological, archaeological, and historical records all point toward the same conclusion. Something genuinely unusual has been happening here for a very long time, and we have not yet found the full story. There is a particular quality to the knowledge held in indigenous oral traditions about landscape that Western scientific inquiry has often struggled to take seriously, and the Nahanni Valley is a case study in what happens when that failure of seriousness costs us information we needed. The Dene peoples of the Mackenzie Valley region did not keep their knowledge in libraries or in journals or in the kinds of repositories that academic disciplines recognize. They kept it in story, in practice, in the accumulated and tested understanding of how a specific landscape works and what it is capable of, knowledge built across generations of direct engagement with the land. This knowledge is not infallible. No knowledge system is infallible, but it is also not simply folk belief to be set aside when it conflicts with what the scientific record shows. In case after case across North America and around the world, oral traditions that were dismissed as legend have turned out to encode accurate information about geological events, about animal behavior, about plant properties, and about human history. The famous Australian Aboriginal traditions that describe the flooding of coastlines at the end of the last ice age turned out, when geologists checked them, to describe events that had occurred thousands of years before the traditions were recorded, and to describe them with a geographical accuracy that required real observation and real memory. The Dene traditions about the Nahanni Valley have that same quality of specificity. They are not vague stories about bad things happening in the wilderness. They are specific accounts of specific kinds of people, specific events, specific locations. The Naha are described in ways that carry information, their physical capabilities, their social organization in broad terms, their relationship to the surrounding peoples, the manner and direction of their disappearance. Whether all of this information is accurate in every detail is impossible to verify, but the structure of the account, the specificity and consistency of it across different informants and different recording periods suggests that it encodes something real. The ethnographic record of the Dene traditions about Nahanni was accumulated primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as anthropologists working in the region recorded oral history from elders who were themselves transmitting knowledge they had received from earlier generations. The most comprehensive of these records come from researchers like Diamond Jennis and Cornelius Osgood, who worked in the Mackenzie Valley region in the early decades of the 20th century, and whose field notes and published accounts remain important primary sources for understanding the cultural landscape of the region at that time. What these records show, when they are read carefully, is a tradition that treats the Nahanni Valley as a place that is both central and peripheral in the geography of the Dene world. Central, in the sense that it is well known, frequently discussed, and assigned considerable significance. Peripheral, in the sense that it is not a place where the Dene communities themselves chose to establish permanent settlements, even though the resources of the valley could have supported settlement in principle. The hot springs could have provided warmth and open water through the winter. The canyon shelter could have protected camps from wind. The river was productive for fishing. The surrounding landscape supported game. But the Dene did not move in. They used the valley for specific and limited purposes, gathering certain resources at certain seasons, conducting certain activities that the valley's specific conditions made possible, and then leaving. They maintained a relationship with the valley that was purposeful and respectful and bounded, and the bounds were not simply practical. They were also about something that the traditions describe as a quality of the valley itself, a quality that is difficult to translate into the vocabulary of contemporary rational inquiry, but that functions in the tradition as a form of recognition that the valley operates by different rules than the surrounding landscape. What those rules were and are is something that the tradition never quite spells out, and this is characteristic of this kind of indigenous knowledge about landscape. The boundaries of safe behavior in relation to a specific place are communicated through practice and through accumulated example rather than through explicit statement. You learn where the limits are by watching what happens when they are approached. You learn the difference between use and violation through the transmitted memory of what happened to those who did not observe it. The prospectors of the early 20th century, the men whose deaths and disappearances form the core of the documented Nahanni mystery, were entering the valley without this knowledge. They did not know the rules because they did not know that there were rules, or rather they assumed that the rules of the wilderness were the same everywhere and that the knowledge they had brought from other wilderness environments would transfer. In some respects, they were right. The basic survival skills, the ability to navigate and to find food and water and shelter, were not irrelevant in the Nahanni Valley. But those skills were not sufficient, and the specific ways in which they were not sufficient were not random. They reflected the specific character of a place that was more demanding and less forgiving than the men who entered it typically recognized. I want to be careful here not to romanticize or misrepresent what the indigenous tradition says about the valley. The Dene tradition about Nahanni is not simply a story about a dangerous place that foolish outsiders died in because they did not know what they were doing. It is more specific than that. The tradition speaks of the valley as a place where human beings encounter something, or something encounters them, that is not present with the same intensity elsewhere. This encounter can be transformative, or it can be destructive, depending on factors that the tradition addresses, but that do not translate neatly into the language of cause and effect, as we typically use it. This sounds mystical, and in the framework of the tradition, it is mystical, and that is appropriate. But there is an observable correlate to the mystical framing. The Nahanni Valley is a place where the expected does not always happen, where the standard models do not always apply, where the experience of being there is qualitatively different from the experience of being in comparable wilderness environments. People who have spent significant time in the valley, researchers and guides, and experienced wilderness travelers consistently describe it in terms that emphasize this quality of difference. It is not simply that the canyon is bigger, or the falls are louder, or the terrain is more challenging than expected. It is that the cumulative experience of the place adds up to something that feels different in kind, not just in degree, from other wilderness environments. This could be the product of suggestion, of knowing the legend before arriving, and therefore being primed to experience the place as different. That is a genuine possibility that cannot be ruled out. Expectation powerfully shapes experience. But the quality of the descriptions from people who have spent extended time in the valley, particularly people who have spent time there in the deep interior, where the tourist and day visitor experience does not reach, suggests something more than simple expectation fulfillment. The researchers who have worked there for extended periods describe changes in their own perceptual and cognitive experience that they struggle to account for by simple reference to the physical conditions, the cold, the isolation, the sound of the river, though all of these are real factors. The sound of the river may in fact be more significant than it is typically given credit for being. The South Nahanni in the canyon sections is not simply loud. It produces sound across a wide frequency range, and some of the frequencies it produces fall below the threshold of conscious hearing, but within the range that is known to have physiological effects on the human nervous system. Infrasound, sound at frequencies below approximately 20 Hz, can produce effects ranging from mild unease to significant anxiety to visual anomalies and alterations in spatial perception, depending on the frequency, intensity, and duration of exposure. The canyon walls of the Nahanni are effective resonators, and the amplification and shaping of the river's sound by the canyon geometry could potentially create localized concentrations of infrasound that would affect the experience of anyone spending time in those sections of the canyon. This is speculative, and it has not been systematically measured in the canyon context. But the infrasound hypothesis for anomalous experiences in certain environments has been taken seriously enough by researchers in acoustics and perceptual psychology to warrant investigation, and the Nahanni Canyon is exactly the kind of environment where it would be worth measuring the acoustic properties carefully. None of this explains the burned cabins or the missing prospectors. Infrasound does not burn buildings, but it could contribute to the quality of experience that the valley produces in its visitors, to the sense that something unusual is happening here, to the heightened state that makes unusual events feel more significant and more memorable. And it could be part of what the indigenous tradition is encoding when it describes the valley as a place that operates by different rules, a physical and physiological reality, experienced as a qualitative difference in the nature of the place, encoded in the tradition as a spiritual distinction between this landscape and the surrounding world. The story of Nahanni Valley is also, in ways that are less often discussed, a story about the politics of knowledge, whose observations count, whose testimony is taken seriously, what standards of evidence apply, and are they applied consistently. The indigenous peoples of the region told the first European traders and explorers who penetrated the Mackenzie Valley that the Nahanni was a place to approach with great care, a place that had done extraordinary things to people, a place whose interior was not to be entered casually. This was testimony from people who had generations of direct experience with the landscape, transmitted through a knowledge system that had been developed and tested over a very long period. It was, by any reasonable standard, expert testimony about a specific environment from a group with unparalleled expertise in that environment. It was not taken seriously, not because the indigenous people were thought to be lying, necessarily, but because the kind of knowledge they were offering did not fit the categories of knowledge that the incoming culture recognized. It was spiritual knowledge, or it was superstitious knowledge, or it was the kind of thing that primitive people said about places they did not understand. 19. In any of these interpretive frameworks, it was not actionable knowledge, not the kind of thing that would stop a prospector from entering a valley where there might be gold. And men went in and men did not come back, and the legend grew, and eventually scientists came to investigate the legend, and the scientists found things that were genuinely interesting. But the scientists came with their own categories and their own standards of evidence, and some of what they found did not fit neatly into those categories, and those things got set aside or remained unpublished, or were quietly left for some future, more adequate investigative framework to deal with. The pattern is circular and frustrating. The indigenous knowledge pointed at something real. The early visitors died or disappeared in ways consistent with the indigenous warning, but not explicable in terms the incoming culture had ready frameworks for. The scientists arrived and found evidence of things that were interesting but not quite conclusive, and the legend filled in the gaps that the evidence left open, with exactly the kind of dramatic narrative that makes the genuine findings harder to discuss. What would break the circle? Better science, more systematically conducted and more thoroughly published. Better integration of indigenous knowledge into the research framework, not as background legend, but as a primary source deserving the same rigorous analysis that the geological and archaeological evidence receives. Better historical investigation of the documented deaths and disappearances, with the specific goal of distinguishing between what can be explained by ordinary causes and what genuinely resists explanation. And, perhaps most importantly, a willingness to sit with genuine uncertainty without rushing to resolve it in either the direction of the supernatural or the direction of dismissal. The Nahanni Valley is genuinely mysterious, not in the manufactured sense that the internet loves, where every unusual place is assigned a conspiracy and every unsolved death is attributed to forces beyond human understanding, but in the older and more serious sense of the word mystery, meaning a genuine unknown, a question that the available evidence does not answer, but that the available evidence makes it very clear, is worth asking. The valley is asking something. It has been asking for as long as people have entered it and attempted to understand it on their own terms, and it has been asking in ways that are consistent across very different kinds of people and very different historical periods. The prospectors heard one version of the question, the indigenous peoples heard another, the scientists have heard a third, and none of them, alone, has the full answer. That is not a failure. That is what mystery looks like when it is real. Let me take you to a specific moment in the recent research history of the valley, because moments are sometimes more illuminating than generalizations, and this particular moment captures something of what I have been trying to describe about the quality of scientific investigation in the Nahanni. In 2006, a joint research team from the University of British Columbia and the Northwest Territories government conducted a detailed survey of the Rabbit Kettle Hot Springs area with the specific goal of using the tufa mound as a proxy record of the valley's environmental history. The tufa mound, which is composed of calcium carbonate deposited by the spring water over time, grows at a rate that can be measured, and that reflects the chemistry and the temperature and the flow rate of the spring. By sampling the mound at different depths, it is possible to reconstruct the history of the spring's activity across the period of tufa deposition. The survey found, as expected, that the mound had been depositing for a very long time, much longer than any historical record of the spring's existence. The oldest tufa at the base of the mound was dated to a period well before the end of the last ice age, which confirmed that the spring had been active and flowing during the glacial maximum. This was consistent with the refugium hypothesis. If the spring was active during the last ice age, it was maintaining a pocket of warm ground and open water in the middle of a glacially impacted landscape, and that pocket would have been a potential refuge for cold-sensitive organisms. But there was something else in the tufa record. At certain depths in the mound, corresponding to specific periods in the past, there were layers with unusual chemical signatures that indicated disruptions in the normal flow pattern of the spring. These disruptions were interpreted, in the initial analysis, as evidence of seismic events, earthquakes, that temporarily altered the underground hydrology feeding the spring. The valley does lie in a seismically active zone, and the interpretation was reasonable. But one of the researchers, working through the data with an interest in the human history of the site, noticed something that was not in the initial analysis. The timing of some of these disruptions corresponded within the resolution that the dating methods allowed. to periods that other evidence suggested were periods of significant human activity in the region. The correlation was not perfect, and the dating resolution was not fine enough to establish a causal link, but it was notable enough that the researcher made a note of it and sought out a colleague with expertise in the effects of human activity on spring systems. The consultation led to a discussion of whether it was possible, in principle, that human modification of the spring area, deliberate alteration of the tufa mound or the spring outlet, could produce the kind of chemical signature observed. The conclusion was that it was theoretically possible, depending on the nature and scale of the modification, but that the evidence was not sufficient to establish this as a more likely explanation than the seismic one. This is exactly the kind of moment I am talking about, a finding that is anomalous relative to the simplest explanation, a cross-disciplinary consultation that raises a new possibility, a conclusion that the evidence is insufficient to resolve the question, and the finding then becomes a note in the research record, a question mark that points at something that deserves more investigation, and the more investigation has not yet happened. The accumulation of these note-form question marks in the Nahanni research record is itself a finding of a kind. No single one of them is sufficient to overturn the standard understanding of the valley's history, but the pattern of them, the way they cluster around specific questions about specific periods and specific processes, is suggestive in a way that a thoughtful reader of the full record cannot easily dismiss. The questions cluster most densely around two periods. The first is the late glacial period, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, when the combination of the refugium potential and the demographic pressure of post-glacial recolonization of the landscape would have made the valley a particularly significant location for whatever human groups were in the Mesta region. The second is the period corresponding to the supposed existence of the Naha, which the oral tradition places within the last few thousand years before European contact, and which the archaeological record very weakly but consistently supports as a period of sustained and possibly unusual human activity in the valley. What links these two periods is the hot springs. In both cases, the springs would have been the primary resource drawing sustained human attention to this specific location in a landscape that offered many alternative locations for subsistence activity. The springs are the constant. The human groups that used them changed, their technologies changed, their cultural practices changed, but the springs remained, pulling people back to this specific place in the landscape across thousands of years. This is not unusual in the archaeology of hot spring locations globally. Thermal features have been attracting human use for as long as there have been humans, and sites associated with hot springs have produced some of the most significant archaeological findings in various parts of the world. The Nahanni is interesting not because it has hot springs, but because the hot springs are embedded in a landscape of such extraordinary physical character, and because the overall combination of features in the valley makes it an unusually rich and unusually complex site for understanding the deep human history of the region. What the valley may ultimately give us, if the research that is needed is ever properly conducted, is a window into a period of North American prehistory that remains genuinely obscure. The transition period between the end of the Ice Age and the establishment of the cultural traditions that are recognizable in the late prehistoric and early historic record. This is a period of rapid change, of population movement and cultural transformation, of extinctions and adaptations, and the emergence of new ways of being human in a rapidly changing landscape. It is a period for which the evidence is thin across most of North America, partly because the conditions of the period did not favor the preservation of cultural material, and partly because the sites of the period are often underwater, buried under sediment, deposited by the retreating glaciers, or swallowed by the rising seas that accompanied the glacial melt. The Nahanni Valley, with its unusual preservation conditions and its long history of human use, may be one of the places where this transitional period is best represented in the archaeological record. The caves, with their continuous stratigraphy and their protected environments, may hold the kind of chronological sequence that is almost impossible to find elsewhere in the region. The tufa mound and the other thermal features may preserve proxy records of environmental change across the relevant time period. The oral traditions of the surrounding peoples may encode information about events in this period that has been faithfully transmitted across the intervening millennia. All of this remains to be properly investigated. The investigation would require resources, commitment, and the kind of collaborative approach that brings together geological expertise, archaeological expertise, indigenous knowledge expertise, and the logistical capacity to work effectively in an environment as demanding as the Nahanni. It would also require, perhaps most importantly, a willingness on the part of all involved to be surprised, to encounter findings that do not fit the existing frameworks, and to treat that non-fit as information rather than as an anomaly to be explained away. The valley has been trying to tell us something for a very long time. The prospectors heard it as danger, and some of them died of it. The indigenous peoples heard it as sacredness, and structured their relationship with the place accordingly. The scientists have heard fragments of it, encoded in the age of the caves and the chemistry of the springs and the dates on the charcoal in the sediment. And the legend has heard it as mystery, and has dressed that mystery in the most dramatic clothes available. The truth, whatever it is almost certainly more interesting and more nuanced than any of these framings fully captures. That is the nature of real things, as opposed to stories about real things. Real things resist the simplifications that stories impose on them. They have more dimensions, more textures, more unexpected internal consistencies, and unexpected contradictions than any single narrative framework can accommodate. The Nahanni Valley is more than the headless valley of the legend. It is more than the karst canyon system of the geological literature. It is more than the post-contact tragedy of unexplained deaths and burned cabins. It is more than the indigenous sacred landscape of the Dene tradition. It is all of these things simultaneously, and it is also something that none of these frames quite catches, something that is perhaps best understood, not as a subject to be explained, but as a question to be lived with. There is a larger argument embedded in the Nahanni Valley story, one that connects this specific place to the broader and deeply contested territory of pre-Columbian North America. And that argument is worth making explicitly because it illuminates why the Nahanni findings matter beyond the valley itself. The conventional history of pre-Columbian North America, the version taught in schools and reproduced in most popular accounts, presents the period before European contact as one of relatively simple and sparse human habitation in most of the continent, with the exception of a handful of regionally complex societies, the Mississippian cultures of the southeast, the ancestral Puebloans of the southwest, the mound builders of the Ohio Valley. These are acknowledged as genuinely complex societies with significant achievements. But the implication of the conventional framework is that most of the continent, and particularly the far north, was thinly populated by small mobile groups who left little lasting trace on the landscape. This framework has been under sustained and serious challenge from archaeologists and other researchers for several decades now, and the challenges come from many directions simultaneously. They come from the dating of sites that push back the timeline of significant human presence in various regions of the continent. They come from the recognition that the archaeological record is systematically biased toward durable material culture in preserved contexts, which means it underrepresents nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who used organic materials and moved frequently. They come from the LiDAR revolution, the use of airborne laser scanning technology to detect surface features under forest cover, which has revealed the extent of earthwork, terrace, and field systems across large areas of the Americas that were previously invisible and whose scale was simply not anticipated by the conventional framework. They come from the genetic record, which tells a story of North American human history that is considerably more complex than a single founding population moving through the continent, showing evidence of multiple founding populations, of back migrations, of mixing events between populations that the conventional model would not predict, and of population crashes and recoveries that must be associated with events that are not yet clearly identified in the archaeological or historical record. The Nahanni Valley, in this larger context, is one data point in an emerging picture of North American prehistory that is much more complex, much more interesting, and in some ways, much more humbling than the conventional version. The refugium hypothesis, if correct, implies that the Nahanni Valley was a location where human populations survived through the last glacial maximum with a degree of continuity that is not reflected in the standard models of post-glacial recolonization. The Naha tradition, if it reflects a real historical population, implies the existence of a distinct human group in the subarctic interior of North America, whose history does not fit into any of the standard population histories derived from either the archaeological or the genetic record, as they are currently understood. These are not marginal claims. They are hypotheses that emerge from a serious engagement with the available evidence and that have testable implications. The testing has not been done comprehensively enough to evaluate them properly, but the evidence that is available is consistent with them in ways that should at minimum make them subjects of serious investigation rather than dismissal. The broader argument about pre-Columbian North America that is relevant here is this: the continent, as it existed before European contact, was not the empty or nearly empty landscape that the colonial imagination and much of the subsequent historical and archaeological tradition has represented it as. It was a landscape shaped by thousands of years of human activity, in patterns and at scales that we are only beginning to understand. The implications of this for how we understand North American history, both the deep prehistoric period and the more recent period leading up to European contact, are significant. One of the areas where this argument has the most force is in the far north, precisely the region where the Nahanni Valley sits. The northern interior of Canada has been treated by most accounts as one of the least modified and least intensively used landscapes in North America, a genuinely wild landscape that human populations passed through but did not significantly alter. The evidence from sites like the Nahanni suggests that this characterization may be wrong in important ways. Hot spring environments, as I have noted, were not simply used by people passing through. They supported sustained occupation in ways that differ significantly from the hit-and-run exploitation of a resource-and-move-on model that the conventional framework applies to most northern foraging groups. When an environment supports sustained occupation, it also supports the accumulation of ecological knowledge, the development of practices adapted to the specific features of that environment, the transmission of that knowledge across generations, and eventually, the development of a relationship with the landscape that is qualitatively different from the relationship of a passing visitor. This kind of sustained and knowledge-rich relationship with a specific landscape is exactly what the indigenous oral traditions about the Nahanni describe, both for the Naha themselves and for the Dene communities that maintained a bounded but purposeful engagement with the valley across generations. The tradition reflects a knowledge of the valley that is specific and deep, the kind of knowledge that is built up not in years but in generations, and the presence of that knowledge is itself evidence of long engagement. What might sustained occupation of the Nahanni Valley thermal environment have produced over the very long periods that the geological evidence suggests were available? This is a speculative question, but not an idle one. The comparative evidence from thermal environments in other parts of the world is instructive. In Yellowstone, which is the most comparable hot spring environment in North America in terms of scale and geological character, archaeological evidence shows a continuous human presence going back at least 9,000 years, with evidence of specialized use of the thermal environment that goes beyond simple exploitation of the warm water for comfort. The area around Yellowstone has produced some of the most unusual archaeological material in the western United States, including evidence of long-distance trade in Yellowstone-sourced obsidian that extends across most of the western and central portions of the continent, suggesting that the area was not simply a local resource, but a node in larger exchange networks. If the Nahanni Valley has been supporting sustained human occupation across a comparable time span, it is reasonable to ask whether it too served as a node in regional exchange networks, and what kinds of knowledge and material culture those networks might have carried. The copper deposits of the valley, the unusual plant species maintained by the thermal refugia, the specific lithic materials available in the canyon walls, these would all represent potential trade goods for groups connected to the valley through long-term relationships. The mineral pigments deserve particular attention. Red ochre and other mineral pigments are among the most widely traded materials in North American prehistoric contexts. They appear at archaeological sites, far from their geological sources, transported over distances that demonstrate the existence of long-range exchange systems. The specific pigment sources used by different groups at different periods are identifiable through chemical fingerprinting, and this fingerprinting has been used to trace the geography of prehistoric exchange networks with considerable precision. The geological formations of the Nahanni Valley include deposits of iron-bearing minerals that produce red and yellow ochres, and these deposits are of high quality by the standards used in the prehistoric North American context. If people were using and potentially trading these minerals from the Nahanni, the chemical signature of Nahanni-sourced ochre could in principle be identified in archaeological sites across the region. This kind of analysis has not been specifically applied with the Nahanni as a potential source, to my knowledge, and it represents a relatively straightforward line of investigation that could potentially establish the valley as a source of traded material and therefore as a node in a regional exchange network. But even without this specific analysis, the broader argument holds. The Nahanni Valley has the characteristics of a place that would have been important, not just as a local resource, but as a regional resource, known to and used by people across a much larger territory than the valley itself encompasses. And a place that is regionally important attracts sustained attention, sustains cultural significance across generations, and leaves traces in the traditions and material culture of peoples at significant distances. This may be one of the reasons the oral tradition about the Nahanni is so specific and so consistent across the Dene communities of the region, even though these communities did not choose to settle permanently in the valley. The valley was important enough, in enough ways, to multiple groups, that knowledge about it was maintained carefully and transmitted faithfully, even when direct engagement with it was limited. The early 20th century deaths and disappearances, when viewed through this lens, take on a different character. The men who entered the Nahanni Valley and did not return were not simply unlucky wilderness travelers. They were entering a landscape that was, in the indigenous understanding, under a form of custodianship, a landscape to which access was regulated not by any human law, but by the accumulated tradition and understanding of what the valley demanded from its visitors. Violating that tradition, treating the valley as simply another piece of wilderness to be exploited, carried consequences that the tradition had long predicted and that the record of early 20th century deaths appears to confirm. This is not mysticism. It is a way of describing the practical reality that the valley is genuinely dangerous and that its dangers are specific in ways that require specific knowledge to navigate safely. The knowledge existed. It existed in the indigenous communities that had maintained their relationship with the valley for generations. But the men who died in the early decades of the 20th century did not have that knowledge, did not seek it out from those who did, and in some cases explicitly dismissed the warnings that were offered. We do not know for certain what specific factors caused each death and disappearance in the Nahanni record. Some were undoubtedly ordinary wilderness fatalities. Some may have involved conflict. Some may reflect factors that we cannot fully identify from the available evidence. But the pattern of the record, the density of unexplained deaths in a relatively small area over a relatively short period, suggests that the valley was imposing costs on its visitors that went beyond what the standard risk calculations for subarctic wilderness would predict. And the Dene had been saying exactly this for as long as anyone had been listening. The parallel between what the Dene tradition said and what the empirical record shows is not proof of anything supernatural, but it is evidence that the tradition was encoding real information about a real phenomenon, and that the dismissal of that information cost lives that a more respectful and attentive relationship with indigenous knowledge might have saved. This is one of the lessons that the Nahanni Valley offers, and it is a lesson that extends well beyond the valley itself. The knowledge systems of peoples who have lived in intimate relationship with specific landscapes for thousands of years contain information about those landscapes that is not available in any other form. That information is not always accurate, and it is not always separable from its cultural and spiritual context in ways that make it directly usable by people operating in different frameworks. But it is real, and dismissing it because it is embedded in a tradition different from the Western scientific tradition is a form of epistemic arrogance that has consequences. The Nahanni Valley is a place where those consequences have been particularly visible and particularly severe. Men died in ways that might have been avoidable if they had listened to what the indigenous peoples of the region were telling them. Scientific findings have accumulated slowly and incompletely, partly because the most important contextual knowledge about the valley, the knowledge embedded in the Dene tradition, was not systematically integrated into the research framework until very recently. And the legend of the Headless Valley has persisted and grown, because the genuine mysteries of the place were not explained in ways that were accessible and satisfying to the general public, leaving the field open to narratives that are more dramatic than accurate. The more accurate account is what I have been trying to offer tonight, or this morning, wherever you are. It is necessarily incomplete, because the valley itself is incomplete, in the sense of being not yet fully known or understood. But it is grounded in what can be established from the available evidence, and I hope it is illuminating in ways that the legend alone, for all its dramatic power, cannot be. Let me take you back to the valley itself for a moment, because I want you to have a sense of what it is like to be there, based on the accounts of people who have been in the interior sections, beyond the tourist routes and the established camp spots, in the parts of the valley that are genuinely remote and genuinely demanding. The first thing that people consistently describe is the silence. And by silence they mean not the absence of sound, but the presence of a specific kind of acoustic environment that is defined by the river and the canyon, and the wind in the trees, and the calls of the birds that live in this specific habitat, and that is empty of any human-generated background noise. There are no aircraft overhead in the deep canyon sections. There are no distant road sounds. There are no electrical hums. The soundscape is entirely biological and geological, and the experience of existing within that soundscape for an extended period produces effects on perception that are difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced them. People describe becoming more attentive, not in the effortful way of maintaining alertness in a situation that demands constant vigilance, but in a quieter way that feels more like the attention opening itself to the environment rather than being deployed toward it. This is what traditional ecological knowledge practitioners describe as the mode of attention that is necessary for reading a landscape deeply, and it is interesting to encounter it described spontaneously by people who have had no exposure to that tradition. People also describe a heightened awareness of time, or rather a diminished certainty about time, in the absence of the cues that ordinarily mark its passage. Scheduled meals, changing light levels through windows, the sounds of human activity waxing and waning with the day's progression. In the canyon, the light changes with the sun's angle relative to the canyon walls, rather than simply with the hour, and the patterns of light and shadow in the deep sections are complex enough that the experience of time becomes genuinely different from the ordinary experience. These observations matter because they suggest that the quality of experience in the valley is genuinely different from the ordinary in ways that are not simply the product of suggestion or expectation. The acoustic environment is different. The light environment is different. The absence of human background noise is different, and these differences produce real effects on perception and cognition that are well documented in the science of environmental psychology. Some of the anomalous experiences reported in the valley, including some that have been attributed to supernatural causes, may be traceable to these environmental conditions in ways that are scientifically comprehensible without being in any way mundane. The infrasound generated by the river in canyon sections, the unusual light patterns produced by the canyon geometry, the effects of prolonged exposure to an environment with no human background noise, these are real phenomena with real cognitive and perceptual effects. They do not explain everything in the Nahanni record, but they may explain more than is sometimes acknowledged. And yet, even accounting for all of this, there remains something in the valley that resists the ordinary explanatory frameworks. The bones in the cave dated to 10,000 years ago, the markings in the inaccessible sections of the canyon wall, the burned cabins and the missing men, the Naha who were there and then were not, the hot springs that should not exist at this latitude and this intensity, the canyon that should not have been cut where it was cut, the lights that appear at night in the canyon sections. Each of these things has an explanation, or a candidate explanation, or a range of candidate explanations. But the explanations are not uniformly satisfying, and the fact that so many things in this one place require non-ordinary explanations, even if each individual explanation is in principle available from the toolkit of established science, is itself something worth reflecting on. The valley is a place where the world is doing something that takes more explaining than usual, and the question of why this particular place generates this particular density of things that need explanation is one that the available explanations do not entirely answer. This may be the deepest and most honest thing that can be said about the Nahanni Valley. It is a place where the explanations are harder than usual, and where the questions are more interesting than the answers that are currently available. That quality, that persistent surplus of question over answer, is what makes it a genuinely significant location in the human geography of North America, and what makes the research that has been done there, fragmentary and incomplete as it is, worth studying carefully. And it is what makes the indigenous tradition about the valley, with its insistence that this place operates by rules that ordinary human frameworks do not capture, worth taking seriously as a form of knowledge rather than simply as legend. The Nahanni Valley will keep its secrets for as long as the secrets remain unasked in the right way, by the right combination of people with the right frameworks and the right access and the right willingness to be surprised. Whether that combination will ever fully assemble is uncertain, but the valley will still be there, the canyon still cutting, the springs still flowing, the caves still waiting for the people who will enter them with the instruments and the knowledge and the patience to hear what they have to say. The Nahanni Valley has been formally recognized as one of the most significant natural sites in the world, and yet the recognition has not fully translated into the kind of systematic scientific attention that the place deserves. The World Heritage designation that came in 1978 was originally based primarily on the geological and geomorphological significance of the canyon system, and the subsequent expansion of the park's boundaries in 2009, which tripled the protected area, was based on a combination of conservation and cultural considerations. But recognition and investigation are not the same thing, and the valley remains, in many of its most interesting dimensions, inadequately investigated. The situation is not static, however. In recent years, there has been a genuine effort to bring more systematic research attention to the valley, partly driven by the recognition that climate change is affecting the landscape in ways that may be altering the preservation of archaeological material, and that time may therefore be a factor in the research agenda. The permafrost in the surrounding region is thawing, and as it thaws, it releases material that has been frozen for thousands of years, including biological and cultural material that may provide new evidence for the valley's human history. In some respects, this creates new research opportunities. In others, it creates urgency, because material that thaws is material that can decompose and be lost. A joint project between Parks Canada and several indigenous communities in the Decho region has been working to document the cultural landscape of the valley in a more comprehensive way than has previously been attempted, integrating indigenous knowledge with the scientific and historical record in an approach that treats the former as a genuine source of data rather than simply as contextual background. This project has produced findings that have not yet been fully published, but that are reported to include the identification of sites that were known in the indigenous tradition but had not previously been located in the physical landscape, sites that when examined archaeologically have yielded material consistent with the traditional accounts of how they were used. This kind of integrated approach is exactly what the Nahanni Research Program has needed and has not had until very recently. The traditional knowledge about the valley describes specific locations with specific histories, and those descriptions, when taken seriously as evidence, rather than dismissed as legend, can direct archaeological survey to exactly the places where material is most likely to be found. The efficiency gain of this approach, compared to systematic survey of an entire large and difficult landscape, is enormous, and the findings that emerge from it carry a different kind of significance, because they come with indigenous cultural context attached. One of the things that the Indigenous Knowledge Program has produced is a more detailed map of the valley's cultural geography, the distribution of locations that were significant in the traditional use of the landscape, and the specific activities that were associated with each. This map reveals a pattern of use that is considerably more structured and more intentional than the conventional picture of nomadic groups moving through the landscape in response to resource availability. The significant locations cluster in predictable ways relative to the geological features of the valley, with the highest density of cultural significance associated with the hot spring areas, the cave systems, and the sections of the canyon that offer the most shelter from weather, combined with the best visibility of the surrounding landscape. This is the pattern you would expect if people had been using the valley for a very long time and had developed a detailed and specific knowledge of exactly which locations within it offered which combinations of resources and shelter and safety. It is the pattern of settled knowledge rather than the pattern of opportunistic use, and it implies a depth of engagement with this specific landscape that is not consistent with the conventional model of sparse and casual occupation. The mapping project has also documented locations associated in the indigenous tradition with specific events that the tradition dates to deep in the past, but that are described with enough specificity to be testable against the physical record. Some of these location event pairs have been examined archaeologically, with results that are broadly consistent with the traditional account, though the dating precision available is not sufficient in most cases to establish the match with certainty. There is one location in particular which I will not identify more precisely than this, because the specific location is considered sensitive in the indigenous tradition, where the mapping project found a correspondence between a traditionally significant site and a physical feature that had not previously been identified in the scientific literature. The feature was visible once you knew to look for it, but it was subtle enough that it had been missed in previous surveys that had covered the area. When it was examined, it proved to be consistent with the kind of feature that the tradition associated with the location, and sampling of the associated sediments produced material that could be dated. The dates are not yet published, and I do not have access to the specific numbers. What I have been told by someone involved in the project is that the dates were, in the researchers' words, older than expected, but not impossibly so, and that they were consistent with the hypothesis that the traditional knowledge was encoding information about events that had occurred considerably earlier than the most conservative estimates of occupation in the region would predict. This is tantalizing and frustrating in the way that unpublished research findings always are. Something significant may have been found. The dating may support or challenge the conventional understanding in ways that matter, but until the findings are in the literature, they cannot be evaluated properly, and the appropriate response is to note their existence and to wait. The pattern of finding things that matter and waiting for them to enter the publishable literature is the dominant pattern of the Nahanni research history, and it is worth noting explicitly that this is not unique to the Nahanni. It is the nature of research in complex, sensitive, logistically challenging environments to proceed slowly, with findings accumulating in field notes and institutional reports and conference presentations long before they reach the journals. The Nahanni has attracted a particular density of interesting findings relative to the amount of systematic investigation that has been applied to it, which is itself suggestive. But the conversion of those findings into formal scientific knowledge has been slow. What is clear, from the totality of the evidence, is that the story the Nahanni Valley is telling is not the story that the legend has been telling. The legend's story is about headless corpses and mysterious disappearances and possible supernatural presences in an unusually dangerous wilderness. And while the elements of that story have real historical roots, the framing is both too dramatic and too shallow to capture what is actually going on. The real story is about deep time. It is about a landscape that has maintained distinctive features across geological periods that dwarf the span of human history. It is about human beings finding those features and returning to them across thousands of years, building up a relationship with this specific place that is encoded in the archaeological record, in the biological record, and in the living oral tradition of the people who have maintained the closest relationship with it. It is about the difficulty of recovering that history from a landscape that is as challenging to the archaeologist as it is to the wilderness traveller, and about the consequences of not recovering it, the gaps in understanding that allow legend to fill the spaces where evidence should be. It is also about what happens at the edges of the known, in the places that do not fit neatly into the categories and models that our disciplines use to organize the world. The Nahanni Valley is one of those places. It is not unique in this quality, but it is unusually concentrated and unusually consistent in its resistance to neat categorization. The canyon should not be where it is, geologically speaking. The springs should not be as warm as they are, climatically speaking. The humans should not have been as present as long as they seem to have been, archaeologically speaking. And the tradition should not be as detailed and as specific as it is, if it is simply legend with no historical basis. None of these individual anomalies is fatal to the standard models. Each can be accommodated, with some adjustment, within the established frameworks. But their accumulation in one place suggests that the established frameworks are missing something about this particular location, something that might be recoverable through better research and better attention. The scientists who have worked in the valley know this. The researchers who have spent time there and who have brought their expertise and their instruments into that extraordinary landscape have consistently come away with a sense that there is more here than has been found and more to find than the current state of the research suggests. This is not mysticism. It is the sober professional assessment of people who understand both what they are looking for and what they have found, and who recognize the gap between the two. That gap is the Nahanni Valley's most important current scientific feature. Not what has been discovered, though what has been discovered is genuinely significant. Not what the legend says, though the legend encodes real historical knowledge alongside its dramatic embellishments. But the gap between the two, the space between what we know and what we need to know to understand this place properly, is where the real significance of the valley lies at this moment in its research history. That gap is also what makes the valley worth this conversation. We are not discussing a mystery that has been solved and whose solution is merely dramatic. We are discussing a place where the questions are still open and where the answers, when they come, may genuinely change our understanding of North American prehistory in ways that matter. Consider the possibility that the refugium hypothesis is correct, that human groups survived the last glacial maximum in or near the Nahanni Valley. This would mean that some of the people who recolonized the surrounding landscape as the glaciers retreated were not newcomers to the region, but returning residents, people whose ancestors had lived in the valley for tens of thousands of years, who carried the valley's specific ecological knowledge with them as they moved back into the opened landscape. The cultural and genetic implications of this are significant. The people who expanded from such a refugium would carry a specific profile that might be identifiable in the genetic and archaeological record of the surrounding region, if anyone knew to look for it. Consider the possibility that the Naha represent a real historical population that disappeared as the result of epidemic disease following contact with other indigenous groups from outside the valley. This would mean that the collapse of a population with deep roots in the valley's specific ecological tradition occurred in the relatively recent prehistoric period, and that the oral tradition is encoding a genuine and specific historical event that occurred within the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. The implications for how we understand the demographic history of the subarctic are significant, and the possibility that the archaeological record of the valley contains evidence of this collapse, in the form of a sharp transition in the material culture or an interruption in the continuity of site use, is testable. Consider the possibility that the rock art in the inaccessible sections of the canyon reflects a tradition that is both older and more widespread than is currently recognized, connected to the deep human history of the valley and perhaps to the regional exchange networks that linked the valley to a much larger geographic area. The implications for the study of pre-Columbian art and cultural transmission in North America would be significant, particularly if any of the motifs can be shown to share characteristics with rock art traditions from distant regions. Any one of these possibilities, properly investigated and properly established, would be a significant finding in North American prehistory. The possibility that all three are true simultaneously, that they are aspects of a single complex history playing out in one extraordinary place, is the kind of finding that genuinely reshapes the picture. This is what scientists have found at the Nahanni Valley, or more precisely, what they have found and not yet fully found, glimpsed and not yet fully seen. It is a finding that is still in progress. It is a story that is still being told by the landscape to the people who are willing to listen to it carefully. And what the landscape is saying, if you listen carefully enough, is this: there was more going on here than anyone thought, for longer than anyone thought, by people who were more capable and more sophisticated and more deeply connected to this specific place than the conventional history of North America has given them credit for. And the evidence for all of this is here, in the caves and the spring deposits and the canyon walls and the bones in the sediment and the knowledge in the living tradition, waiting for the tools and the attention and the willingness to be surprised that will finally allow it to be fully known. The Nahanni Valley does not give up its secrets easily. It has been holding them for a very long time, long before there were people asking questions in the language of scientific inquiry, long before there were prospectors with gold pans and government maps, long before there were legends about headless men and mysterious disappearances. The secrets are in the rock and the water and the air of the place, in the biological memory of organisms that have been there since the ice retreated, and in the cultural memory of the peoples who maintained their relationship with it across all the time that followed. When you hear the South Nahanni River in the canyon sections, you are hearing water that has been making that sound for millions of years, cutting through rock that was laid down hundreds of millions of years before that. in a landscape that has been shaped by forces operating on timescales that human history cannot contain. The valley does not belong to any of the stories that have been told about it. It predates them all, and it will outlast them all. What we can do, and what is worth doing, is to engage with the valley on its own terms as much as possible, bringing our best tools and our most careful attention and our deepest willingness to sit with uncertainty and to listen, not just for the dramatic revelations that the legend promises, but for the quieter and more significant truths that the landscape is consistently offering to anyone who is paying sufficient attention. Those truths are the ones that matter. They are the ones that can change how we understand not only this specific valley, but the larger story of human presence in North America. And through that story, something about the nature of human beings in general, our resilience, our adaptability, our capacity to maintain meaningful relationships with specific places across spans of time that exceed easy comprehension. The Nahanni Valley is one of the places where that capacity has been most fully expressed and most deeply tested, and what has survived that testing, both in the landscape and in the tradition, is worth the most serious attention we can bring to it. That is what the scientists found there. That is what the scientists are still finding, and that is why this valley, in the subarctic wilderness of Canada's northwest, in a place that most people will never visit and few will ever fully understand, matters. It matters because the deep past is not simply background to the present. It is present in the landscape that surrounds us, in the traditions that surround us, in the genes that we carry and the knowledge we inherit and the relationships we maintain with specific places on this earth. The Nahanni Valley carries more of that deep past than most places, and the effort to understand it is the effort to understand something important about where we come from and what we are. That is worth the attention, that is worth the time, that is worth the 3 hours of a night that might otherwise have been spent in silence, lying in the dark with thoughts that go nowhere. Instead, they go to a canyon in the Canadian Northwest, where the river is still running, the springs are still flowing, and the walls still hold marks made by hands that belong to people whose story we have only begun to tell. Rest now, wherever you are. Let the river keep running in your mind. Let the canyon walls close around it. Let the stars move overhead in the same patterns they moved in when the valley was new to human eyes, and the first people stood at its edge and decided to descend. You are part of that same long story. So is the valley. So is everyone who has ever stood at the edge of something unknown and chosen to learn it rather than fear it. The Nahanni will still be there in the morning. So will the questions. And somewhere in the world right now, someone is sitting in a tent in the canyon, listening to the river in the dark, carrying the instruments and the notebooks and the accumulated knowledge of everything that has come before, trying to hear what the valley has to say. May they listen well. May they have the patience to stay long enough to hear. And may the findings, when they come, be as extraordinary as the place that produced them. Good night, or good morning. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is, thank you for making this journey with me into the subarctic dark, into the canyon that should not exist, to the springs that should not be warm, toward the story of people who should not have been here as long as they were, but who were here nonetheless, and who left their mark on a landscape that has not yet finished telling us what they knew. Let me tell you about something that the geological surveys have documented, but that has received almost no attention outside of the technical literature. The thermal gradient anomalies of the Nahanni subsurface. Geothermal gradient measurements, the rate at which temperature increases with depth below the Earth's surface, are conducted routinely as part of resource exploration surveys. The normal gradient in continental crust is approximately 25 to 30 degrees Celsius per kilometre of depth. In areas of elevated geothermal activity, the gradient can be considerably steeper. In the Nahanni Valley region, gradient measurements taken in boreholes, drilled as part of mineral exploration surveys, have returned values that are anomalously high in specific localized areas, higher than the regional average by margins that cannot be entirely explained by the simple model of deep fault zones and enhanced deep circulation. The specific locations where the anomalous gradient measurements were recorded are, with one exception, not coincidentally, the same locations where the surface thermal features are most pronounced. This is expected. What is not expected, and what has not been satisfactorily explained, is the steepness of the gradient in the uppermost portion of the profile in some of these measurements. In a standard deep circulation system, the gradient would be relatively flat in the upper portion of the profile, where the influence of surface temperature variations and shallow groundwater movement dominates, and steeper in the deeper portions, where the influence of the deep heat source dominates. In several of the Nahanni profiles, this pattern is inverted or complicated in ways that suggest the heat is being delivered from depth in a more concentrated and more vertically focused manner than the standard model predicts. This technical finding does not reveal ancient civilizations or underground chambers. It reveals a subsurface heat delivery system of unusual geometry, which is interesting in its own right as a geological phenomenon, and which may have implications for understanding why the surface thermal features are where they are, and why they are as intense as they are. But it is also interesting from the human prehistory standpoint, because the locations of maximum thermal intensity at the surface, the places where the heat is most directly and most intensely accessible, are exactly the places where the archaeological evidence for human use is most concentrated. People went to the hottest spots. This is exactly what you would expect. But the pattern of exactly which spots within the valley were hottest, and why, is a question that the current geological understanding does not fully answer, and the locations that were hottest in the periods of maximum importance for human settlement may not have been identical to the locations that are hottest today. Hot spring systems evolve. The plumbing changes. Springs open and close and shift over time as the underground pathways that feed them are modified by mineral deposition, by seismic activity, by changes in the hydrostatic pressure of the groundwater system. The Nahanni hot spring system 10,000 years ago may have had a different surface expression than it does today, and the locations that were most significant for human use then may not correspond to the locations that are most visible now. This is one of the factors that makes the archaeological survey of the valley particularly challenging. You cannot simply survey the areas around the current hot springs and expect to capture the full pattern of historical use, because the historical pattern was organized around a thermal geography that may have been different from the present one. You need to understand the geological history of the thermal system in order to predict where the significant archaeological sites from different periods are likely to be located. The tools to do this exist. Subsurface geophysics, ground-penetrating radar, and resistivity mapping and seismic surveys can reveal the underground structure of the thermal system and allow researchers to reconstruct its evolution over time. Combined with the kind of systematic dating of the surface thermal deposits that the Rabbit Kettle survey has demonstrated is possible, it is in principle achievable to map the thermal geography of the valley across the time periods relevant to human occupation. But this work has not been done systematically, and without it, the archaeological survey is working with an incomplete map. The point is not that the research has been done badly. The research that has been done as well as the resources and logistics allowed. The point is that the valley is complex enough to require a level of research investment that has not yet been committed, and that in the absence of that investment, the findings are necessarily fragmentary and the questions remain open. Open questions are not comfortable things to live with. Human beings prefer closure, prefer explanations, prefer stories that resolve. The Nahanni Valley is a place that resists this preference, and the legend of the valley has in part been shaped by the desire for resolution in the absence of the kind of evidence that would actually produce it. The headless prospectors are a resolution of sorts. The valley is dangerous, and dangerous things happen there. The Naha are a resolution of sorts. There were people here once who are gone now. The lights and the anomalous experiences are resolved by attributing them to supernatural presences. None of these resolutions is satisfying on close examination, but they are more satisfying than sitting with the genuine uncertainty, and that is why they have persisted. What the genuine uncertainty feels like, if you are willing to sit with it, is something like this. You are standing at the edge of a canyon in the subarctic, and the river below you is doing something extraordinary, cutting through 1,000 meters of limestone in a way that should not have been possible given the geography of the landscape. The walls around you contain caves that have been developing for hundreds of thousands of years, and that have held things inside them for all of that time, things that are only beginning to be understood. The ground beneath your feet is warm from springs that have been flowing since before the last ice age, and that maintained this pocket of warmth through the thousands of years when the surrounding landscape was frozen. And somewhere in the oral tradition of the people who have lived near this place for as long as anyone can remember, there is specific and detailed knowledge about what this place is and what it has done and what is required to engage with it appropriately. You are standing in that place with that knowledge and that uncertainty, and you are aware that the story of this place is not finished, that there are chapters still to be written, that the evidence for those chapters exists in the rock and the water and the sediment and the tradition, but has not yet been fully recovered. That awareness, that sense of standing at the edge of something not yet fully known, is what the Nahanni Valley offers to those who engage with it honestly, and it is perhaps the most valuable thing it offers. Science progresses through exactly this kind of productive uncertainty. The places where the questions are hardest and the evidence is most resistant to easy interpretation are precisely the places where the most significant discoveries tend to be made, because the difficulty is a signal that the standard models are encountering something they were not designed to handle. The Nahanni Valley has been signaling this repeatedly and consistently for as long as researchers have been paying systematic attention to it. The geologist, who first had to explain how a river cut through a mountain ridge, found an answer, superimposition, that is now part of the standard geological literature and that has been applied to comparable situations elsewhere. The finding was significant not just for understanding this one river in this one valley, but for the general understanding of how rivers and landscapes interact over deep time. The archaeologist, who found human material in a cave dated to 8 or 10,000 years ago, found an answer to a local question about who was where and when, but the implications reach outward from that local question to the general question of the deep history of the subarctic and the timing and pattern of post-glacial recolonization. The indigenous knowledge practitioners, who have been documenting the cultural geography of the valley, have found answers to questions about where significant locations are and why, answers that are simultaneously practical for the immediate purposes of cultural resource management and deep for what they reveal about the long human relationship with this landscape. These findings build on each other. They are not isolated, and the building process is not finished. The next generation of research in the valley, if it can bring together the disciplinary expertise and the logistical capacity and the indigenous knowledge partnership that the valley requires, may find things that make everything found so far look like the preliminary sketch for a much larger and more complete picture. The valley is waiting for that research. It has been waiting, in a sense, for a very long time, patient in the way that geological and biological systems are patient, operating on timescales that make human research programs look like brief interruptions in a much longer process. The springs keep flowing, the canyon keeps cutting, the caves keep accumulating sediment layer by layer in the dark. The traditions keep being transmitted, carefully and faithfully, in the communities whose relationship with this landscape is the oldest and the deepest. And in the dark of the canyon, in the sections that no tourist reaches and no researcher has yet fully surveyed, the walls keep whatever marks are on them, keep them safe and still and cold in the limestone, waiting for the eyes that will look at them, and the minds that will understand them, and the frameworks that will finally be adequate to what they represent. There are places in the world that ask more of us than ordinary places do, not in the sense of demanding effort or endurance, though the Nahanni certainly demands both, but in the sense of asking us to expand our frameworks, to hold more uncertainty than we are comfortable with, to recognize that the knowledge we have is provisional, and that the knowledge we do not yet have may be more important than what we do. The Nahanni Valley is one of those places, and the fact that it sits in the subarctic wilderness of Canada, far from the places that attract the most scholarly and popular attention, makes its demands on us more rather than less significant. It is easy to expand our frameworks in response to evidence from famous and well-studied sites. It is harder, and perhaps more valuable, to do so in response to evidence from a place that most people will never visit and that most research programs have not fully committed to investigating. The world's deepest mysteries are not always located in the most obvious places. Sometimes they are hiding in plain sight in a subarctic canyon, warm with thermal waters and silent with geological time, holding everything that has happened there in layers that human science is only beginning to learn to read. That is the Nahanni Valley. That is what scientists found there, and what they are still finding, and what they have not yet found but know is there. And that is why this place, of all the extraordinary places on this extraordinary planet, is worth 3 hours of attention in the dark before sleep finally comes. Let the river run. Let the canyon hold its depth. Let the springs flow warm through the frozen ground. And wherever you are tonight, let the knowledge that the earth beneath you has its own deep history, longer than any human story and stranger than any human legend, carry you gently into whatever dreams are waiting. The Nahanni will still be there when you wake, and somewhere in its limestone walls, the marks that no one has yet deciphered are still waiting for the person who will understand them. Sleep well, the valley endures. There are stories within the Nahanni story that deserve their own careful telling, stories that have been compressed or omitted in the broader account, and that carry specific information about how the valley has shaped the people who encountered it. Let me tell you a few of them, because the specific is often more illuminating than the general, and the Nahanni is a place where the specific details matter in ways that go beyond their individual significance. There was a man named Raymond Patterson who spent a winter in the Nahanni Valley in 1927 and 1928, trapping and prospecting in the upper reaches of the watershed, and who wrote about his experience in a book called The Dangerous River that was published in 1954. Patterson was not a scientist and not a particularly unusual person in terms of his wilderness skills and his reasons for being in the north. He was an Englishman who had come to Canada and fallen in love with the country, and who wanted, like many young men of his era, to experience the last genuinely wild places before they disappeared. He spent the winter in the Nahanni, survived it, and came out with observations about the valley that are valuable precisely because they come from a careful observer with no particular agenda other than honest description. What Patterson described is a valley that was beautiful beyond anything he had expected and dangerous in ways that were not always visible until they became immediately threatening. He wrote about the river's power with a respect that never tipped into sensationalism, describing the specific ways in which the canyon's hydraulics created hazards that were not obvious from the water's surface. He wrote about the winter silence in the upper valley with a quality of attention that communicates what that silence actually feels like, the way it presses in, the way it changes the perception of space and of one's own presence in that space. And he wrote, carefully and with appropriate uncertainty, about the persistent sense in certain sections of the valley that something was different about the quality of the attention the landscape seemed to direct toward you. He was not the kind of man who used language like that casually, and his description of it is worth reading with the same care he brought to his observations about the river's hydraulics and the winter's cold. He was describing something he had actually experienced, in the language of a careful observer trying to be accurate about something that did not have a standard vocabulary. What Patterson also described, and what has made his book particularly valuable to researchers interested in the early 20th century history of the valley, was the physical and material evidence he encountered during his time there, of people having been in the valley before him in ways that were not consistent with any recent use he could account for. Old caches of food and supplies left in locations that would have required considerable knowledge of the valley to choose well. Remains of structures in places that seemed more permanent than any seasonal camp would need to be. Signs of activity in locations that a casual visitor would not have found, and that implied familiarity with the valley's interior geography that went well beyond the knowledge a prospector would typically acquire. He did not dramatize these observations or attach dramatic interpretations to them. He simply noted them as facts, as things he had encountered that he could not fully account for, and moved on. The restraint is itself informative. Patterson was not trying to enhance the mystery of the valley. He was trying to describe it accurately, and what he described accurately included things that did not have obvious explanations. His account has been used by later researchers as a reference point, a documented first-person observation from someone with no particular stake in the valley's mysteries being more mysterious than they actually were. The things Patterson saw and described are consistent with the things that systematic archaeological investigation has subsequently found, not identical, but consistent, which gives them a weight that pure legend does not have. The summer expeditions of the 1960s and 1970s, the period when the valley first began attracting the attention of researchers with training in disciplines relevant to its most interesting features, produced a set of informal records that have never been fully compiled or analyzed. The researchers who went in during those decades were typically working on specific questions with specific instruments, and their observations outside the scope of their primary mission were recorded informally, in field diaries and letters, and the kind of conversation that happens around a campfire at the end of a working day in a remote location. Some of those informal records have been preserved, scattered across institutional archives and private collections, and they contain observations that are interesting enough that someone should compile and analyze them systematically. The accumulation of careful informal observations from trained observers across a period of several decades represents a significant body of evidence about the valley's character and its specific patterns of anomaly, and losing that evidence through institutional neglect or attrition would be a genuine research loss. The specific quality of attention that the Nahanni demands, and that the best observers of the valley have brought to it, is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of the valley's research history. Science is often thought of as a method for removing the observer from the observation, for obtaining results that are independent of who conducted the investigation. But in environments as complex and as incompletely understood as the Nahanni Valley, the quality of the observer matters enormously. An observer who brings only their narrowly defined disciplinary toolkit to the valley will see only what their toolkit allows them to see. An observer who brings broader awareness, who is attentive to the details that fall outside the primary research focus, who is willing to note anomalies without immediately resolving them, will see considerably more. The people who have contributed the most to the understanding of the Nahanni Valley have consistently been people who brought this broader quality of attention to their work there. The naturalist from the 1950s expedition who noted the plants he could not identify, the researcher who noticed the correlation between the tufa disruption layers and the possible periods of human activity, the indigenous knowledge practitioners who have been documenting the cultural geography of the valley with systematic attention to both the physical features and the traditional knowledge associated with them. These are people who are paying attention with their full range of capacities, not just with their technical instruments. This is what the valley seems to require, not because it is supernatural, not because it has some special ability to reveal itself only to those who approach it in the right spirit, but because it is genuinely complex and genuinely demanding, and the kind of attention that is adequate to its complexity is not the kind of attention that can be generated by narrowly defined research programs operating within the comfortable bounds of established disciplinary knowledge. The valley is, in the end, a teacher of a specific and uncompromising kind. It does not yield its knowledge to the impatient, or the narrowly focused, or the overconfident. It yields it slowly and partially, and in ways that require integration across multiple frameworks to understand. This is not metaphysics. This is just an accurate description of a genuinely complex natural and cultural system that has been developing for a very long time and that contains more information than any single investigative approach can extract. The scientists who have worked there know this about it. They come back from the valley changed in ways that are difficult to articulate, but that are real and consistent across very different kinds of people. Changed in their relationship to uncertainty, in their appreciation for the depth of human history in places that look empty, in their understanding of what the landscape itself can tell you if you are willing to listen to it in the full range of its expressions, rather than only in the narrow band that your instruments are calibrated to detect. That change is the valley's most durable gift to the people who have engaged with it seriously. And it is, in a quiet way, the best evidence we have that the valley is telling us something important. Not in the dramatic sense of hidden cities and ancient secrets and catastrophic revelations, but in the older and more deep sense of a place that has been shaped by deep time and that offers, to those who approach it with sufficient humility and sufficient attention, a glimpse of that depth. The story of what scientists found at the Nahanni Valley has not ended. It is ongoing. Every field season that brings researchers into the canyon adds to the record. Every piece of sediment that is dated, every bone fragment that is analyzed, every mark on the canyon wall that is documented, adds another element to a picture that is slowly becoming more complete. The completeness is still distant. The picture still has vast empty sections, but the edges of what is known are expanding carefully and systematically, and the unknown is yielding, slowly and incompletely, but genuinely, to the quality of attention that the valley deserves. Stay with the uncertainty, sit with the openness of it. The Nahanni Valley has been here through ice ages and interglacials, through the rise and fall of human populations and human traditions, through everything that has happened on this continent and in this landscape across a span of time that makes the entire period of recorded history look like a single afternoon. It will be here through whatever comes next, keeping its secrets at whatever pace the research community is willing to commit to unlocking them. And tonight, wherever you are, you have held a piece of that mystery in your mind for a while, turned it over, examined it from several angles, and perhaps come away with a sense of what the valley is, and what it means, and why it matters. That is not nothing. That is, in a small way, part of the ongoing work of understanding this extraordinary place. Rest now. The canyon is still cutting. The springs are still warm. The stars overhead, if you could see them through your ceiling, are the same stars that the first people to stand in the Nahanni Valley looked up at and wondered about. You are part of the same long wondering, and the valley is part of the same long answer. There is one more thing worth saying about the Nahanni Valley before the conversation closes, and it is perhaps the thing that is hardest to say clearly without either overstating it or dismissing it. It is about the relationship between human beings and specific places on the earth, and about what it means when a place has been important to human beings for a very long time. We live in an era that is, in many respects, deeply disconnected from specific places. Many people in the industrialized world live in cities or suburbs that have been so thoroughly reshaped by human activity that their specific geological and biological character is almost entirely invisible. The place exists as the connection between a specific place and a specific human community that has lived with that place for generations, that has built up knowledge of it and relationship with it and identity through it, is rare in the modern world and becoming rarer. The Nahanni Valley is a counterexample. It is a place that has maintained its specific character, its genuine unusualness, its persistent capacity to produce experiences and evidence and questions that do not fit ordinary frameworks. Precisely because it has not been thoroughly reshaped by human activity in the way that most of the inhabited world has been. The canyon is still cutting. The springs are still flowing at the temperatures and in the locations they were flowing in when human beings first encountered them. The caves are still dark. The walls are still marked in ways that reflect decisions made by people who are gone, but whose presence can still be detected by the trained eye. This persistence is part of what makes the valley valuable and part of what makes the research agenda so important. The window into the deep past that the valley offers is open precisely because the valley has been allowed, through combination of its own inaccessibility and the protection offered by its park status, to remain substantially intact. That window will not remain open indefinitely. Climate change is altering the valley's conditions. The permafrost is thawing. The thermal balance that has maintained the hot spring environments in their long-established form may shift in ways that alter or destroy some of the features that make the valley scientifically significant. The urgency of the research agenda is not simply a matter of scientific interest. It is a matter of preservation, of recording and understanding before the record is altered or lost. The Nahanni Valley has been holding its secrets for longer than any human tradition or any scientific discipline has been asking about them. It is not going to give them all up at once. It is not going to produce a single dramatic revelation that resolves all the questions simultaneously. It is going to yield its knowledge, slowly, piece by piece, to the careful and sustained attention of people who are willing to go there, to work there under difficult conditions, to integrate the multiple kinds of knowledge that are required to understand it, and to sit with the uncertainty that the valley generates as a natural and appropriate response to its own depth and complexity. That is the work. That is what the valley requires. And that is what makes it worth all of this attention, this long conversation in the dark, about a place that most people will never visit, and that has been keeping its secrets for a very long time. The canyon holds everything that has happened in it. The rock remembers. The water carries the record of its source in its chemistry. The sediment accumulates the story of what has fallen into it across time. And somewhere in that accumulated record, the full story of the Nahanni is present, waiting not for discovery, so much as for the readiness to receive it. The world the valley inhabits is ancient and patient and indifferent to the urgency of human inquiry. The valley will be there long after everyone who has ever asked questions about it is gone, long after the current round of research has been published and absorbed and superseded by the next round, long after the categories and frameworks that researchers currently use to understand it have been revised beyond recognition. The limestone will still be dissolving, the springs will still be flowing, the river will still be cutting, and in the dark of the caves, Whatever is in there will still be in there, waiting for the light that has not yet found it, patient in the way that only the genuinely ancient can be patient, indifferent to the questions that human beings are asking and not asking, present in the way that only places that have outlasted all the stories told about them can be present. That is the Nahanni Valley. Rest well. One more thread deserves to be followed before the night fully closes in, and it concerns not what was found in the valley, but what was found just outside it. In the broader landscape of the Mackenzie Mountains and the Selwyn Range that form the valley's western and southern walls. Archaeological survey in the mountain zones surrounding the Nahanni has produced findings that are consistent with, and in some ways more extensive than, the findings from the valley interior itself. The mountain passes that provide access to the valley from the south and west show evidence of repeated and purposeful use over a very long period. The lithic material found at pass sites includes types that are not from local sources, stone that was carried to these locations from considerable distances, which implies that people were using these passes as deliberate routes of travel rather than simply passing through opportunistically. The direction of travel implied by the distribution of non-local lithic material is interesting. Some of the material comes from sources that would require travel from the south and east, from the interior plains and the boreal forest zones. Some comes from sources to the north, and some, in smaller quantities and at fewer sites, comes from sources that would require traversal of the mountains from the west, from the Pacific drainage side of the ranges. This multi-directional influx of material to the mountain pass sites surrounding the Nahanni is consistent with the valley having been a destination, a place that people traveled to from multiple directions rather than simply a corridor through which they passed en route to somewhere else. A destination requires something worth going to. The hot springs, the shelter of the canyon, the specific mineral and biological resources of the valley, all of these constitute what was worth going to, and the multi-directional movement of people and materials to and from the valley is consistent with its role as a regional node in a larger network of human activity that we are only beginning to understand.